The morning. Dale Gruber grabbed Magnolia Boone by the arm in front of every soul at the Calhoun County stockyard and said, loud enough for the whole crowd to hear, "Sit down, sweetheart. The grown men are trying to do business here." That was the morning everything changed. Not for Dale, for Magnolia. She was 26 years old, standing in Nebraska dust with $41 in a coffee tin and 47 pigs nobody wanted. Every farmer in that yard laughed. Some looked away, embarrassed for her. A few pointed. And Dale Gruber, the man who had already bought her father's best pasture land for a quarter of what it was worth 6 months after the funeral. Dale just smiled like a man who had never once been wrong about anything. He was wrong about her. And what she built next would make sure he knew it for the rest of his life. If this story moves you, if you've ever been underestimated, laughed at, or told to sit down, subscribe to this channel right now and follow Magnolia's journey all the way to the end. Hit that like button. Drop your city or country in the comments below because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't miss what comes next. You'll want to be here for all of it. The Calhoun County Livestock Auction ran every third Saturday of October, and it drew the kind of crowd that made Magnolia Boone feel like she was standing in a photograph she didn't belong in. She had driven the 12 miles from her homestead in a borrowed wagon with a bad left wheel that wobbled whenever she hit a rut, which on a Nebraska dirt road meant it wobbled constantly. By the time she pulled into the stockyard, her hip ached and her dress was dusty, and she could feel people looking at her before she even climbed down from the seat. That was something she had learned to feel. The particular quality of attention that wasn't admiration or curiosity, the kind that calculated. She was a large woman. She had been large since childhood, and she had spent 26 years learning exactly what that meant in a place like Calhoun County, Nebraska, in the autumn of 1887. It meant people finished what they were saying before they listened to her. It meant that when she walked into a room, certain men said nothing at all, and certain women said too much, filling the air with the kind of bright, brittle kindness that was its own form of dismissal. It meant that whatever she said was always filtered first through the question of whether a woman who looked like her could possibly know what she was talking about. She knew what she was talking about. Her father, Clement Boone, had been a practical man. Not a warm one, but practical in a way that turned out to be a form of love she didn't fully recognize until after he was gone. He had taught her the Smokehouse the same way he'd taught her to read, which was to say, without ceremony, without praise, just patient repetition until she could do it right. She had been 9 years old the first time she helped him pack salt around a shoulder cut. She had been 14 when he let her manage the fire on her own. She had been 19 when she watched him die of a chest infection in February, and understood, standing in the kitchen afterward with her hands still smelling of wood smoke, that the farm was hers now, and there was nobody left who was going to help her run it. 7 years of alone. 7 years of making every decision herself, which she was actually reasonably good at, and of living with the consequences of those decisions, which she was also reasonably good at, and of finding reasons to keep going when the weight of the land and the debt and the silence of an empty house pressed down on her at 3 in the morning, which she was less good at but had managed anyway. The debt was the part that had started to feel like a living thing. Clement Boone had borrowed against the land twice before he died, once for equipment that mostly worked, and once for a barn roof that definitely worked, but had cost more than the original estimate. The bank in Grover held the notes. A man named Arthur Fisk held them on the bank's behalf, which meant Arthur Fisk was the one who showed up every 6 months to review her accounts, with an expression that suggested he found both her accounts and her personally to be a disappointment. She had $41 in a coffee tin inside her coat when she walked into that stockyard. $41 and 4 months until the next note payment was due. She had already sold the winter wheat, already sold the 2 cows she could spare, already made every cut she could think of making. She had been down to 3 meals a day and then to 2, and had told herself this was fine, this was practical, this was manageable, right up until the morning. She had sat at her kitchen table and done the arithmetic for the 4th time and gotten the same answer all 4 times, which was that she was going to lose the land by March. Unless she did something that was either very smart or very stupid, and she wasn't entirely certain which. The pigs came up midway through the auction. Lot 23. 47 retired breeding sows, property of Harlan Getz, who was liquidating his operation and moving to Kansas to live near his daughter. Retired breeding sows were a specific category of animal, past their peak productivity, too old for most farmers to bother with, heavy feeders who required care, and returned questionable value. The conventional wisdom, which was stated out loud by several men standing near Magnolia as the auctioneer introduced the lot, was that retired sows were worth maybe half their weight in a sale yard. Good for sausage. Not much else. 47 of them, said a man behind her. Who's got the barn space for 47 sows that can't breed and can't earn their feed? Harlan always kept too many, said another man. That's always been his problem. The bidding started low. It stayed low. The farmers who might have considered it were already calculating what the feed would cost through winter against what the meat would bring in spring, and the math wasn't inspiring. Magnolia stood in the third row and watched the numbers climb with the particular sick feeling of someone about to do something irreversible. She bid. The man next to her turned and looked at her the way people looked at her. That calculating look, that assessment, and then turned back to the auctioneer as if he'd concluded the bid wasn't serious. She bid again. Someone else bid. She bid again. The crowd had started to notice. It was at $38 that Dale Gruber found her in the crowd. Dale Gruber was 43 years old and operated the largest cattle operation in the county, and he had the particular confidence of a man who had never had to wonder whether people were taking him seriously. He was not a large man, but he occupied space in the way that certain men do, as if the air around him was also his. He had bought her father's east pasture 6 months after the funeral, during the period when Magnolia had been trying to understand the debts, and had needed to liquidate something quickly. He had offered her $800 for land that was worth at minimum $1,200, and she had been 23 and frightened, and she had taken it, and she had thought about it almost every day since. He pushed through the crowd toward her. He reached her just as the bidding hit 39. Miss Boone. He said it loud. Not shouting, but loud enough. The particular volume of a man who wants witnesses. What exactly do you think you're doing? Bidding, she said. She did not look at him. She watched the auctioneer. On a lot of retired sows. Yes. Do you have any idea what retired sows? I know what retired sows are, Mr. Gruber. He laughed. It was a short laugh, not really meant to communicate amusement. It was the kind of laugh that was really a statement. With what money? Clement didn't leave you. I mean, forgive me, but the whole county knows you're— I'm bidding, she said. With my own money, for my own purposes. She finally looked at him. You're welcome to bid against me if you'd like. He looked at the sows. He looked at her. He made a calculation that she could read clearly on his face. These animals weren't worth his time or his money, and this woman wasn't worth serious attention, and bidding against her would be ridiculous, and he didn't want to be ridiculous. So instead, he grabbed her arm. Not roughly, but he grabbed it. His hand closed around her forearm, the way you'd grab a child who is about to do something dangerous, and he pulled her half a step back and said, in the voice he probably used with children and women who needed redirecting, Sit down, sweetheart. The grown men are trying to do business here. The stockyard went quiet. Not completely quiet. The auctioneer was still calling the number, somewhere far away. But the 20 or 30 people in their immediate vicinity went quiet, and Magnolia Boone felt every single one of them watching her, waiting. She looked down at his hand on her arm. She looked up at his face. She said very quietly, Let go of my arm, Mr. Gruber. He let go. But he smiled doing it, the smile of a man who had already won. $41, she called to the auctioneer. A beat of silence. $41, the auctioneer said. Do I hear 42? Nobody spoke. Somewhere in the crowd someone laughed. Not the cruel kind, but the disbelieving kind, which was almost worse. Then a few more. Then the murmur that started to build into actual conversation, which meant the crowd had already made up its mind what kind of scene this was. 41 going once, 41 going twice. She spent everything she has on dead pigs, Dale Gruber said, still loud, still performing for the crowd. Lord have mercy on the foolish and the fat. The gavel came down. Magnolia exhaled. She had 47 retired sows and no money and 4 months to make something impossible work. She walked to the auctioneer's table to pay, and she was aware of people parting for her as she went. Not out of respect, but out of the way you make room for someone who's made a spectacle of themselves. A young woman near the fence caught her eye and looked away fast. An older farmer shook his head. 2 men she recognized from the feed store were already talking to each other in low voices, and not bothering to hide the fact that they were talking about her. Harlan Getz was waiting at the table. He was a lean, weathered man in his 60s, and he didn't look at her the way the others did. He took her $41 and counted it carefully and said, without looking up, "You know what you're doing with these animals?" "Yes, sir," she said. He glanced up then. "Because they're not worthless. People just don't know how to look." It was such a small thing to say, such a small, ordinary thing. But she felt it land somewhere in her chest and stay there. "I know," she said. The drive home took 2 hours longer than the drive in because she was moving 47 sows down a dirt road, and sows are not cooperative in any circumstance, let alone 47 of them on a road they didn't know. By the time she got them into the back pasture, it was coming on dark, and her hip hurt worse than it had in months. And she was so tired she stood at the fence for a while with her forehead against the top rail and her eyes closed. She could hear the sows moving around in the dark behind her, snuffling, settling. They sounded nothing like worthless. She had a plan. She had been building the plan for the better part of 2 years, in the careful, unglamorous way she built most things, a little at a time, testing each piece, adjusting. Her father's smokehouse sat on the north side of the property, dug back into the hillside so that 2 of its 4 walls were earth. Clement Boone had built it that way because the earth held temperature, because temperature was control, and because he understood, and had passed this understanding to his daughter, that great smoked meat was not a matter of recipes. It was a matter of time, of patience, of the slow application of consistent low heat and carefully chosen wood, of knowing when to add and when to leave alone, of understanding that the animal had already done most of the work for you and your job was simply not to ruin it. Retired breeding sows were old. That was the point. That was the entire point. Older animals had more fat marbling than younger animals. Their muscle fibers had been working for years, which meant more connective tissue, more collagen, more of the biological material that, when subjected to long, slow heat, broke down into gelatin and coated the meat with something no young pig could ever produce. A well-cured ham from a retired breeding sow, done right, was not just acceptable. It was extraordinary. It was the kind of thing that people tasted and then went quiet because they needed a moment. But getting from 47 old sows in a cold back pasture to that outcome required things she didn't currently have: time, feed, firewood, salt, and the physical capacity to work 7 days a week for the next 4 months. She had 3 of those things. She was working on the other 2. The feed problem was actually a feed opportunity, if she managed it correctly, which was the kind of thinking her father had modeled and she had absorbed. The bitterest, most undesirable apples from 3 neighboring orchards were being left on the ground, too gnarly to sell, not worth the labor to collect. She'd spoken to 2 of those farmers already and arranged to haul the fruit herself in exchange for keeping the orchards clear. Pumpkins were the same. The ones left in the field after the harvest, the undersized and the misshapen, could be had for almost nothing. Mixed with buttermilk from the Henley farm down the road, where they had more than they could use, and balanced with a controlled ration of grain. It was not a cheap diet, but it was a much cheaper diet than it looked. She had done the math. She had done the math many times. The math said it was possible. The math also said it required everything going right, which was not usually how things went. She stood at the fence in the dark for another few minutes, letting the tiredness move through her, and then she pushed away from the rail and walked back toward the house. The kitchen was cold. She built up the fire in the stove and put water on and sat at the table while it heated. She thought about Dale Gruber's hand on her arm. She thought about his voice. "Sit down, sweetheart." She thought about the laughter. She wanted to be honest with herself about this. She was not the kind of person who was driven by the need to prove people wrong. She had read enough foolish stories about that, heard enough speeches about using other people's mockery as fuel, and she believed it was mostly a comfortable lie. Spite was a thin thing to build a life on. It made you work hard, but it made you work angry, and angry work made mistakes. What she was, instead, was certain. She was certain about the sows. She was certain about the smokehouse. She was certain that she had $41 worth of absolutely correct judgment sitting in that back pasture, snuffling around in the dark. The water boiled. She made tea she couldn't really afford, and sat there with it, and was honest with herself about all the ways this could fail, because that was the other thing her father had taught her. You don't ignore the bad outcomes, you plan around them. What if the feed calculation was off? What if a sow got sick? What if the winter came early and hard? What if Arthur Fisk at the bank decided to call the note early? Each question got a contingency. Some of the contingencies were thin. Some of them were basically pray it doesn't happen. She wrote them all down anyway because writing them down made them specific, and specific problems were less terrifying than general dread. By the time she put the paper away, it was past 10. She was going to be up before 5. She banked the fire, checked the back door, and went to bed in a house that had been quiet for 7 years, with the faint sound of 47 sows carrying through the dark from the back pasture. She slept because she was practical, and because tomorrow was going to start very early, and because she had learned, slowly, the way she'd learned most things, that there was nothing she could do between 10 at night and 5 in the morning that she couldn't do better after sleeping. Outside in the cold. Nebraska dark, the sows moved around each other and settled. They were old, and they were alive, and nobody in Calhoun County except Magnolia Boone had any idea what they were worth. She knew. She had always known. She was up at 4:30 the next morning, which was earlier than she'd planned, because one of the sows had gotten herself wedged against the fence gate and was making a sound that carried all the way to the house. Magnolia pulled on her boots in the dark, didn't bother with the lamp, and went out into the cold with her coat half buttoned and her hair still loose. The sow, a wide, gray-faced animal with notched ears that someone had marked years ago for identification, had pushed herself sideways trying to root under the gate and was now stuck at the shoulder, pressing forward instead of backing up, which was exactly what pigs did when they were frightened. They pushed into the problem instead of away from it. "Stop," Magnolia said, not gently. The sow kept pushing. Magnolia put both hands on the animal's haunches and pushed back, hard, repositioning her until she came free of the gate with a lurch and a grunt, and immediately trotted 3 feet away and started rooting in the frost like nothing had happened. Magnolia stood there breathing cold air and looking at the gate, which now had a gap at the bottom where the latch had pulled. She fixed it with a piece of wire she found in her coat pocket. She had started keeping wire in her coat pocket the second week after her father died and had never stopped, and then stood in the dark for a moment taking inventory. The sows were spread across the back pasture in loose clusters, moving slowly, their breath coming up in small clouds. They looked, in the dark, like gray boulders that had decided to wander. None of them looked sick. None of them looked distressed beyond the usual low-level dissatisfaction that was the baseline emotional state of any pig in any circumstance. She counted. 46. She counted again. 46. She did not panic, because panicking in the dark with 46 pigs and a broken gate in Nebraska in October was not useful. She walked the fence line with her hand trailing along the wire, looking for another gap, finding 2 places where the bottom wire had gone slack but not broken, fixing them both with more wire from her pocket. She walked the full perimeter. Then she checked the small holding pen off the north side of the barn, where she'd put 2 of the older animals who'd seemed the most winded on the drive in. The 47th sow was in the corner of the holding pen, lying on her side. Magnolia crouched down. The animal was breathing. She could see the flank rising and falling, but the breath was shallow, and the animal's eye, when Magnolia brought the lamp close, was dull in a way that wasn't good. She put her hand on the sow's side. Warm, but not feverish. She ran her hand along the belly. Nothing obviously wrong, no bloating, no hardness where there shouldn't be hardness. "All right," Magnolia said to the sow. "What's your problem?" The sow didn't offer an answer. She went back to the house and got the tin of dried herbs her father had kept for animal ailments. Ginger root, dried chamomile, a few other things she'd learned to prepare herself because a veterinarian was 12 miles away and charged more per visit than she sometimes earned in a week. And she made a weak, warm mash and brought it back to the holding pen and sat in the cold with the sick animal for 40 minutes, coaxing her to eat small amounts, watching the breathing, waiting. By 6 o'clock, the sow was sitting up. By 6:30, she was on her feet, moving stiffly but moving, and had shoved her snout into the remaining mash with the determined rudeness that indicated she was feeling better. Magnolia sat back against the pen wall and exhaled. She was already an hour behind on the morning feeding. Her knees were damp from the cold ground, and her back hurt in the particular way it hurt when she'd been crouching in an awkward position for too long. She had not eaten anything herself. She had approximately 17 things to do before dark that she had planned to start at 5. She got up, brushed the straw off her coat, and went to start the morning feeding. This was the part of the plan that nobody saw. This was the part that didn't make a story. The 4:30 mornings, and the wire in the coat pocket, and the 40 minutes in the cold with a sick pig, the way every day started with something going slightly wrong and required immediate, unglamorous problem-solving before the actual work of the day could begin. She had not told anyone about the plan and its specifics, partly because she didn't trust the county with her specifics, and partly because explaining it would have required her to argue for it, and she was tired of arguing for things before she'd had the chance to prove them. The feeding system she'd developed used 3 separate stations spread across the pasture, which prevented the dominant animals from crowding out the weaker ones. She had learned this by watching her father watch pigs, which was to say she had absorbed it slowly and early, and it had become instinct. You positioned the feed so every animal could reach it. You watched which ones hung back and made sure they got enough. You did not play favorites, but you noticed everything. The apple and pumpkin mixture went into the troughs first, the slightly fermented fruit smell rising sharp in the cold morning air. Then the buttermilk, which she'd collected 2 days ago from the Henley farm and stored in the root cellar. Then the grain ration, measured carefully because grain was money, and she couldn't afford to waste it. By the time she finished the feeding rounds, it was past 7, and light was coming up flat and gray over the eastern fields. She stood at the fence and did what she did every morning now. She looked at the animals with the specific attention of someone who was trying to see not what they were now, but what they were going to become. The gray-faced one who'd been stuck in the gate was a substantial animal, probably 240 pounds, and she moved with the deliberate weight of an animal who had been well managed in her working years. Good bone structure, good depth through the shoulder. The meat from an animal like that, properly finished and properly cured, would be something. The problem was time. She needed the animals to put on weight before she could begin processing, and the rate at which they put on weight was tied directly to the quality and quantity of the feed. And the feed cost was tied directly to the money she didn't have. And the money she didn't have was tied directly to the debt that Arthur Fisk was going to appear at her door to discuss in approximately 4 months. She had built the math 3 ways: the optimistic version, the realistic version, and what she privately called the brutal version. The optimistic version required everything going perfectly. The brutal version required nothing going wrong. The realistic version was somewhere in between and assumed that approximately 1/3 of what could go wrong would, which had been her father's standard working assumption about Nebraska and life in general. The realistic version said she'd make it, barely. But she'd make it. She had to believe the realistic version, because the alternative was to accept that she'd spent $41 on a public humiliation and was now managing 47 animals toward a failure that would be watched with great interest by everyone in Calhoun County. She went inside and ate oatmeal standing at the stove because sitting down felt like a luxury she hadn't earned yet, and then she went to the smokehouse. The smokehouse was the part of the property she felt most clearly as her father's. He had dug it himself, over 2 summers, with the help of a neighboring man named Prescott who was long dead now. Half underground, half above, built into the north-facing side of the hill so the sun never hit it direct. The walls were stone and packed earth, the ceiling low enough that Magnolia had to duck slightly coming through the door, the air inside cold and dark, and carrying the layered smell of decades of hickory smoke that had settled into the wood and stone until it was permanent, molecular, as much a part of the structure as the mortar. She had spent the first week after the auction cleaning it, which was not a simple task. Clearing out the equipment her father had left, some of it still good, some of it past use, scrubbing the hooks and the hanging rails, checking the firebox and the draft system, relining the sections of the chimney that had gone soft. Physical work, heavy work, the kind that left her hands cracked and her shoulders aching. She had done it alone because there was nobody to do it with, and she had done it carefully because the smokehouse was the entire premise of everything else. The wood was stacked on the east side, hickory and apple wood she had been gathering and cutting for 3 years, not stockpiling for this exact purpose. She hadn't known 3 years ago that she would buy 47 retired sows, but she had been curing small amounts of meat for her own use since she took over the farm, working through the slow curing process her father had taught her, refining it, and the wood had accumulated because good smoking wood accumulated when you took it seriously. She ran her hand along the stack. There was enough for 3 or 4 full processing cycles if she was careful about the ratios. She needed to be careful about the ratios. The first sow she processed 2 weeks in, the gray-faced one who had been stuck in the gate, whose name Magnolia had told herself she was not giving them names, and who she had nonetheless been thinking of as Eleanor, went through the smokehouse over 11 days. Not because 11 days was a rule, because 11 days was what Eleanor's specific size and fat content required, and Magnolia checked the temperature twice a day and adjusted the fire by small increments the way her father had shown her, and did not rush it, and did not cut corners on the salt cure that preceded the smoke, and did not let herself think about what she'd do if it didn't turn out. She thought about it anyway. On day 9, she opened the smokehouse and stood in the doorway and looked at the hanging meat, and let herself notice that it smelled right. Not just good. Right. The specific combination of sweetness and depth and the faint, almost nutty quality that developed when old fat met long, low heat. And she had smelled enough of her father's work to know the difference between meat that was going to be fine and meat that was going to be extraordinary. This was going to be extraordinary. She let herself feel that for about 30 seconds. Then she closed the smokehouse door and went back to the feeding rounds. The neighbors who noticed anything in those first weeks mostly noticed that the Boone woman seemed to be working herself to death over those ridiculous pigs she'd bought. This was the assessment delivered to Magnolia secondhand through a supply delivery man named Otto, who drove out from Grover every 2 weeks and who had a tendency to share county opinion whether it was requested or not. "People are saying you spent everything you had," Otto said, handing down a crate of salt from the wagon. He was a neutral man, Otto, conveying information rather than offering it as an opinion. "People are right," Magnolia said. She set the crate down and reached up for the next one. "They're also saying Fisk is going to take the land in the spring." "Fisk is not going to take the land in the spring. He took the Weatherby place." "The Weatherby place didn't have a smokehouse." She set the second crate down and looked up at him. "Or the knowledge to run one." Otto looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not disbelief, but something that was measuring. He had delivered to this property for 9 years, first to Clement Boone and then to his daughter, and he had watched her work with the reliable attention of someone who passed through regularly and wasn't invested in any particular outcome. "Those pigs are looking better than they were," he said finally. "That's because they're eating better than they were," Magnolia said. He nodded and handed her the next crate. The Henley farm was a mile and a half south, and it was there that Magnolia had arranged the buttermilk exchange, which also turned out to be where she encountered the first unexpected complication of the fall. Ruth Henley was 71 years old, a widow of 11 years, and she had been running her own farm with her daughter Clara for the past decade in the particular way that women ran farms when they weren't supposed to be running farms, which was to say efficiently and without much comment. Magnolia had always respected her without knowing her especially well, because the county was not a place where women formed easy friendships across the distance of farm properties and different generations. She had gone to the Henley farm on a Thursday to collect the week's buttermilk and found Ruth in the yard in conversation with a man she didn't recognize. Mid-40s, well-dressed for a farm call, the kind of dress that meant he'd come from somewhere with paved streets. I was doing the talking, and Ruth was doing the listening with the particular stillness that Magnolia recognized as someone waiting for a conversation to be over. She pulled up and waited. The man glanced at her and went on talking. Ruth looked at her over the man's shoulder with an expression that said, "Be patient, this is almost done." It wasn't almost done. It went on for another 7 minutes, with the man explaining something about contracts and consolidation and the Hendricks Agricultural Partnership, which was a company Magnolia had heard of in the vague way you heard of things that operated in your county without directly touching your life yet. The Hendricks Partnership had been buying up small farms in the region for 2 years. They operated under the principle that large consolidated operations produced more efficiently than small family farms, which was true in a narrow economic sense and also happened to be very good for the men running the Hendricks Partnership, and somewhat less good for the families who had worked those farms for generations. Ruth listened. The man talked. Eventually he produced a card and held it out, and Ruth took it with 2 fingers and said, "I'll think about it," in the tone that meant she would not think about it. The man got back in his buggy and drove away. Ruth looked at the card for a moment, then tucked it in her apron pocket and turned to Magnolia. "How are your pigs?" "One of them got stuck in the gate," Magnolia said. "She's recovered. The buttermilk is doing what I hoped. Come inside. Clara made biscuits." She said it in a way that wasn't really an invitation, more a fact that Magnolia could choose to engage with or not. Magnolia went inside. Clara Henley was 22, quiet in a way that Magnolia initially mistook for shyness and later understood was selectiveness. She didn't talk without reason, but when she talked, it was worth hearing. She was the one who'd figured out how to keep the Henley Farms records in a format that made sense, who'd negotiated their grain contracts for the past 4 years, who handled the kinds of calculations that older farmers often handed off to their sons when their daughters were standing right there perfectly capable of doing them. They sat at the kitchen table and ate biscuits, and Clara asked careful questions about the sow feeding setup that suggested she understood more about feed conversion than most men in the county, and Ruth watched them talk with an expression of someone who was doing her own calculations. That company, Magnolia said finally. Hendricks. Have they talked to you before? Twice, Ruth said. Different man each time, same conversation. Are you going to sell? Ruth looked at her like the question was somewhat naive. No. Are they going to talk to you? I expect so. They like distressed properties. Your property isn't distressed, yet. Ruth said it without cruelty, as a simple acknowledgement of what was publicly known. No, Magnolia agreed. Yet. There was a pause in the conversation that felt like a question forming. Clara refilled the tea. Outside, the wind had picked up. It was doing that now in the afternoons, carrying the first real suggestion of winter. I saw your smokehouse, Clara said, not quite casually. On the hill. When I was driving the north road last week, the door was open and I could smell it. Magnolia looked at her. What did it smell like? Clara seemed to think about this more carefully than most people would have. Like something that took a long time, she said. Like someone knew what they were doing. Magnolia felt something shift in her chest. How would you like to know what you're doing too? She said. I need help with the second smokehouse. The silence that followed was the kind that happened when an offer landed somewhere it hadn't been expected, and everyone at the table needed a moment to see what they thought about it. Second smokehouse, Ruth said. I'm going to need one. The volume I'm planning, the first one can't handle it alone. She had known this for weeks. She had been pushing the knowledge to the back of her mind because building a second smokehouse required materials and labor she didn't have, but she had been stubborn about it in the way she was sometimes stubborn about problems, which was to pretend they didn't exist until she had a solution. I can't pay wages, not yet, but I can teach everything I know, and when the money comes in, there's a percentage arrangement I've been thinking about. Ruth looked at Clara. Clara looked at Magnolia. What kind of percentage? Ruth said. Magnolia told her. She had figured it based on projected production and realistic sale prices, which she had been researching through the Grover market reports that Otto sometimes left behind. The number was honest. Not generous, because she couldn't afford generous, but honest. Ruth was quiet for a moment. My husband built the barn on this property with nothing but what he knew and what he could borrow, she said finally. It didn't sound like it was leading anywhere. Then, Clara, you were asking about the smokehouse. I've been asking about it for a year, Clara said. We should have done something with ours 2 years ago. We didn't have someone who knew what they were doing, Ruth said. She was looking at Magnolia now. Do we have a deal? The second smokehouse problem turned out to have a partial solution already on the Henley property, a stone root cellar they hadn't used since the late summer, built into the east-facing side of a small rise, structurally similar to what Magnolia needed. It needed modifications, a proper firebox, draft adjustments, new hanging rails. It was work, not a miracle. Work they could do. Clara came to the Boone property for the first time on a Monday morning, and Magnolia showed her the first smokehouse the way her father had shown her. Without ceremony and without condescension, moving through each element and explaining not just what it was, but why it was that way. Clara asked the kind of questions that meant she was actually listening. The wrong kind of heat. What happened if you rushed the salt cure? Why applewood and not something else? Because the apple gives its sweetness without going heavy, Magnolia said. You mix it with hickory, about 1/3 to 2/3, and the hickory does the depth and the apple keeps it from getting bitter. She paused. My father was the one who worked it out. He spent about 4 winters getting the ratio right. How long did it take you to get it right? Clara asked. Magnolia thought about this. 2 winters, she said, but I had his mistakes to learn from. The days fell into a pattern that was grueling in the way that sustained physical labor was grueling. Not dramatically, not painfully, in any interesting sense. Just the accumulation of early starts and heavy work, and the kind of tiredness that built up over weeks until she was sleeping deeply every night and waking in the dark anyway because there was something that needed checking. The pigs were the anchor of everything. They needed food and water and monitoring twice a day, minimum, and they needed the kind of attention that wasn't just routine but observational. She was watching for weight gain, for signs of illness, for the social dynamics of the herd, because sick animals lost weight, and fighting animals lost weight, and lost weight meant lost margin. She lost 2 animals in the first month, one to a respiratory illness that she caught late. 1 to an injury, she still wasn't sure how it happened. 45. She recalculated and the math still worked, barely. Dale Gruber came by in the 3rd week of November. She didn't know he was coming. He appeared at the gate on a Tuesday afternoon while she was repairing a section of the pasture fence, and she heard the horse before she saw him and stood up straight before she turned around, because she had decided at some point in the past month that she was not going to let Dale Gruber see her at any kind of disadvantage. He sat his horse and looked at the pasture for a long moment. The sows were moving in the afternoon light, gray and solid and purposeful, and they did not look, Magnolia knew this, had been watching them every day, like worthless animals. They looked like animals that had been fed carefully and managed well, and the difference was visible. "Huh," Gruber said. Magnolia waited. "They're looking better than I expected," he said. He did not sound pleased about it. "Were you expecting something specific?" she said. He looked at her. His expression was the particular expression of a man who had made a public prediction and was starting to understand that it might not come true. "I heard you were curing meat already." "I am." "Selling any?" "Not yet," she said. "When I sell, it'll be worth selling." He shifted in the saddle. She had the impression he had come out here with something specific to say and was deciding whether to say it. "Fisk tells me the note's due in March. Fisk tells you a lot. Fisk tells me things that are useful to know." He looked at the pasture again. "I'm prepared to be reasonable, Magnolia, if it comes to that." She held on to the fence post with one hand and looked up at him. "Be reasonable how? If you can't make the payment, I'd rather see the land go to someone who'll use it right than to the bank." He said it like he was offering her something, like he was doing her a favor by wanting to take her land at the price he'd choose. "I'm not your enemy. Your father and I did business for years." "You paid him honest prices?" A pause. "We negotiated." "I'll keep that in mind," Magnolia said, "when I make the payment in March." He looked at her for another moment. Then he turned the horse and rode back to the gate without hurrying, which was the move of a man who wanted to make sure she understood he wasn't fleeing. She watched him go and felt the complicated anger of someone who understood that Dale Gruber wasn't entirely wrong about the risk, and who resented him for knowing it. She turned back to the fence. The fence needed fixing. She fixed it. Arthur Fisk appeared on a Wednesday in mid-November, unannounced, in the way that bankers appeared when they wanted to remind you of the power dynamic. He was a small, precise man who wore his coat buttoned regardless of the temperature, and he had a habit of looking at everything on a property except the person he was speaking to, which Magnolia found both rude and informative, because what he looked at told you what he valued and what he was assessing. He looked at the pigs for a long time. "Those are the animals from the Getz auction," he said. "Yes." "Retired breeders?" "Yes." He looked at the smokehouse on the hill. "You're already curing." 3 cycles in," she said. "Any sales?" "Not yet." He finally looked at her. "Miss Boone, I want to be straightforward with you. The March payment is substantial, and I've been watching the situation with some concern. If you were interested in a modified payment schedule—" "I'm not," she said. "A modified schedule isn't necessarily—" "A modified schedule means more interest over more time," she said. "I've read the notes, Mr. Fisk. I know what a modified schedule means. I'll have the payment in March." He looked at the pigs again. "You're confident." "I'm prepared," she said, which was different from confident, but she didn't feel like explaining the difference. He wrote something in the small notebook he carried and tucked it back in his coat pocket. "I'll note your position," he said, which was the kind of thing a banker said when he wanted to indicate that he'd noted your position and didn't entirely believe it, but lacked the grounds to push further. After he left, she went into the smokehouse and stood in the dark and quiet and smelled the air and reminded herself of all the reasons the math worked. The reasons were still the same reasons they had always been. They hadn't changed because Fisk had appeared. She ran her hand along the hanging meat and felt the firmness that meant the cure was taking right. Clara came the following Saturday, and they worked on the modifications to the Henley root cellar that afternoon, driving posts and fitting the new firebox parts that a blacksmith in Grover had made to Magnolia's specifications. It was the first time she had spent money she technically couldn't afford in service of the second smokehouse. And it felt like something she was either very confident about or very committed to, and she wasn't sure those were different things. Clara was stronger than she looked, which Magnolia had suspected and which proved true. She worked without complaining and without needing instruction twice, and when she made mistakes, which she did, because everyone made mistakes, She identified them herself and corrected them before Magnolia said anything, which was the best kind of worker. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said at one point, fitting a stone into the chimney lining. "Yes," Magnolia said. "At the auction, when that man grabbed your arm." Magnolia waited. "What were you thinking in that moment?" She set down the tool she was holding and thought about it because she could have given a quick answer and it wouldn't have been honest. "I was thinking about the gate latch," she said finally. "Whether the drive over had loosened it enough that I needed to stop and fix it on the way home, or whether it would hold until I got back." Clara looked at her. "I'm serious," Magnolia said. "I had 47 animals waiting and a gate I wasn't sure about. What he said—" She stopped. "It mattered. It did matter. But I'd already made the bid. The animals were already mine, and I had a gate to check." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she put the stone in place and pressed it firm. "That's actually terrifying," she said. "What is?" "How much you were carrying while all of that was happening." Magnolia looked at her. It was a thing she hadn't thought of that way. "Everyone's carrying something," she said. "Not like that." She didn't answer. She picked up her tool and went back to work. The second smokehouse modifications were finished by the end of November. It wasn't beautiful. Nobody was going to come look at it for the craftsmanship, but it was functional, which was what she needed it to be. The firebox drew clean. The temperature held. She walked through it with Clara and pointed out the things to watch. The spots where heat collected unevenly, the section of the wall that she suspected would need additional insulation when it got colder, the importance of the damper position on high wind days. Clara took notes, actual notes, in a small book she'd brought for the purpose. The first ham that came out of the second smokehouse came out on a Tuesday in late November, and it had been Magnolia's intent to sell it to the hotel in Grover as a test of the market. She had wrapped it carefully and driven it in and met with the hotel's kitchen manager, a broad German man named Hauptmann, who had been running that kitchen for 15 years and who looked at the ham with the professionally neutral expression of someone who had handled many things that were not as good as the person presenting them believed. He cut a thin slice and tasted it. He cut another slice. He tasted that one too. He set down the knife and looked at her and said, "How much can you supply?" She gave him a number. He countered. They agreed on something between. He asked about delivery timing, and she gave him a schedule that was realistic, and he wrote it in his order book, and then he asked whether she had anything else. Shoulders, belly cuts. And she told him she would by February if the current cycle went as planned. She drove home in the cold with an order in her pocket and a number in her head that, when she ran it against the March payment, left a margin that was thin but real. Thin but real. She said those words out loud in the empty wagon, going home in the dark, because she needed to hear them in her own voice. The county found out about the Hauptmann order through the usual routes. Otto the delivery man, probably, or someone at the hotel who talked to someone in the market. By early December, there were 2 other inquiries waiting for her when Otto came by. One from a supply merchant who traded with 3 hotels and one from a man who ran a provisioning business that sold to freight lines. She did not tell either of them yes immediately. She went home and ran the numbers against her capacity, against the timeline of the remaining animals, against the possibility of the things that could still go wrong, and she came back to them 2 days later with a delivery schedule that she could actually meet. Not what they wanted, less than what they wanted, but what she could actually deliver, which she had decided was the only number she was willing to put her name on. The supply merchant took it without argument. The freight provisioner pushed back. "I can move product faster if you can get me more by January," he said. They were standing in the yard, and he was a man who stood close when he talked, which she suspected was a negotiating posture. "I've got demand that's not being met." "I know," she said, "and I'm going to meet part of it, in February, at the schedule I told you." "What if I paid a premium for rush delivery on the first lot?" She looked at him. It was a significant number. She could see what he was offering before he finished saying it, and she knew what it would do to the March margin, and she felt the pull of it the way she'd been feeling the pull of every number that would make the next 4 months easier. She thought about her father's smokehouse, about the 11 days for Eleanor, about what cut corners actually cost, which was not just quality, but reputation, and reputation in this kind of business was the only thing that couldn't be rebuilt quickly. "No," she said. He blinked. "Miss Boone, the meat comes out when it's ready," she said. "If it comes out before it's ready, it's not worth what you're offering me for it. You'll buy it once and not come back." She held his look. If it comes out when it's supposed to, you'll be back in the spring asking for more. That's the arrangement I'm interested in. A long pause. The wind moved through the dry grass. February, he said. February, she agreed. He left. She stood in the yard and felt something that took her a minute to identify, because it wasn't triumph exactly, and it wasn't relief exactly. It was something closer to the feeling of a gate latch that held. She went to check on the pigs. They were fine. 45 animals in the late afternoon light, moving around each other with the comfortable familiarity of animals who had learned the layout of their space and the rhythm of being fed by the same hands at the same times. They had put on weight through the fall, visibly, measurably. They were not the depleted, dull-eyed animals she had loaded into the wagon at the Getz auction. They were, she would have said to anyone who asked, and no one was asking, in the best condition of their lives. She stood at the fence in the cold and looked at them and let herself, just for a moment, think about March. The number. The margin. The thing that had looked 6 weeks ago like a wall she was going to walk straight into. Thin but real. She said it again, quieter, to herself. Then she went to check on the smokehouse fire because it needed checking, and there was still 3 hours of daylight left, and she had work to do. The freight provisioner's buggy had barely cleared the end of the lane when Magnolia realized she was shaking. Not from cold. The afternoon was cold, but that wasn't it. It was the particular trembling that came after she'd held something very still for a long time and then let it go. The conversation, the number he'd offered, the moment of deciding. Her hands were steady when she'd said no to his face. Now they weren't. She pressed them flat against her thighs and stood in the yard until it passed. This was the part of running something alone that nobody talked about. The shaking after. The way the decisions that looked simple from the outside, just say yes, just say no, just do the obvious thing, cost something physical when you were the only person carrying the consequences either way. If the February delivery failed, if a cycle went wrong, if the animals lost ground through the worst of winter, that number she'd turned down would become the number that had saved her. Or would have, if she hadn't been so proud. She would replay this moment in March standing in front of Arthur Fisk. She knew this. She had said no anyway. She went inside and built up the fire and made a pot of coffee that was too strong because she'd measured wrong, and she drank it at the kitchen table with her coat still on and went through the numbers one more time, not because she hadn't already gone through them, but because going through them was the thing she did when the shaking wouldn't quite stop. The math held. The math still held. She poured the rest of the coffee out and went to bed at 8:30, which was the earliest she'd gone to bed since she was 12 years old and had a fever. December came in hard and fast, the way Nebraska Decembers often came, without the gradual warning that more forgiving climates offered. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a single night, and Magnolia woke at 3 in the morning with the instinctive knowledge that something outside needed attention, and found that 2 of the water troughs had iced over completely, and 3 of the older sows had crowded into the corner of the holding area away from the wind, which was not dangerous but was not good for animals she needed putting on weight. She broke the ice and repositioned the windbreak she'd rigged on the east side of the pasture, working by lantern in the dark, with her fingers going numb inside her gloves. Then she went back inside and sat by the stove until her hands worked properly again, and thought about the additional straw bedding she'd need and whether the holding pen was going to be adequate through January. It wasn't going to be adequate through January. She had known this somewhere in the back of her mind and had been pushing it there. She added it to the list of things that needed solving. Clara came 2 days later with Ruth's wagon loaded with extra straw bales from the Henley barn, which Magnolia had not asked for and which she stood looking at for a moment before she understood what she was feeling, which was something close to the specific relief of not having to ask. "Mother said you'd need it," Clara said. She jumped down from the wagon seat with the ease of someone who had been climbing on and off wagons since childhood. "She also said to tell you the second smokehouse held temperature through the cold snap." She checked it herself. "Tell her thank you," Magnolia said. "You can tell her yourself. She's coming Friday." Ruth came Friday, and she walked through both smokehouses with the methodical attention of a woman who had been managing a property for a decade and understood what she was looking at. She said very little. She touched the walls, checked the draft, looked at the hanging meat for a long moment without speaking. "Your father taught you well," she said finally, in the smokehouse on the hill. "He taught me everything," Magnolia said. "The rest I worked out myself. That's how it goes." Ruth looked at a shoulder cut that was in its 6th day. "My husband knew cattle, the way you know this. He could look at an animal and tell you things a veterinarian would need a week to figure out. She paused. I never learned it. I've always regretted that. You learned enough, Magnolia said. I learned enough to survive, Ruth said. That's not the same as knowing. They stood in the cold dark of the smokehouse, and Magnolia thought about that distinction, surviving versus knowing, and how it felt different in her body when she was doing one or the other. The past 2 months had been survival, mostly, managing crisis by crisis, patch by patch. But in here, in the smokehouse, she was doing something else. She was doing something her body understood the way it understood breathing. The Hendricks man came back, Ruth said. Magnolia looked at her. Different one this time, younger. He knew about your operation. She said it carefully. By name. What did he say about it? He said there were consolidation opportunities in the county that were about to become available. Ruth's voice was flat and precise. He didn't say your name, but he mentioned the Boone property specifically, said there was potential for distressed acquisition in the spring. The air in the smokehouse was very still. He knows about the note, Magnolia said. Someone told him. She thought about Fisk and his small notebook and the way he'd said, I'll note your position, and whether a banker who was also watching the Hendricks Partnerships acquisitions in the county would find it professionally interesting to keep them informed about which properties might become available. She couldn't prove it. She filed it. I'm not going to be distressed in the spring, she said. I know, Ruth said, but you should know they're watching. She did know. She hadn't known it this specifically, but she had felt it the way you felt weather coming. The particular pressure change in how people spoke to her, the way Dale Gruber's second visit had been less neighborly and more reconnaissance. There were people in this county who had already decided what her story was going to be, and they were not rooting for the revision. The January cycle was the heaviest one she'd run. 12 animals processed through the first smokehouse in overlapping stages, a schedule she had mapped on paper and revised 4 times until the timing was tight enough to be efficient, but not so tight that a delay in one stage cascaded into problems downstream. Clara managed 2 of the later stages in the second smokehouse with minimal oversight, which meant that what had started as a help arrangement had become something more like a partnership, the real kind, built out of shared knowledge rather than an agreement on paper. There were problems. There were always problems. A section of the first smokehouse chimney threw a crack in the masonry during a hard freeze in early January, and the repair cost her 2 days and the kind of focused anxiety that meant she woke every morning at 4, checking the temperature before she did anything else. One of the sows she'd been planning to process in late January went lame. Not critically, but enough that she decided to hold the animal rather than process her at reduced weight, which required adjusting the schedule by 10 days and recalculating the February delivery number. She sent a note to the freight provisioner adjusting the quantity. He sent one back asking if she was going to make it work. She wrote, yes, different number, same quality, and sent it back. He didn't write again. She took that as acceptance and moved forward. The first freight delivery went out in early February on a morning when the temperature was 11 degrees and the wagon wheels left clean tracks in the fresh snow. She had wrapped everything herself, checking each piece twice, and had loaded it herself even though Clara had offered to help because she needed to put her hands on every piece of it one more time before it left the property. She was not superstitious, but she was thorough. Hauptmann at the hotel received his delivery first, because the hotel was on the way and because she had decided early on that Hauptmann was the kind of buyer she wanted to keep, not because he was paying the most, but because he was paying attention. He'd sent back a note after the first delivery that said simply, "When can I have more of the shoulder cuts specifically?" That kind of specificity meant he was eating it himself or feeding it to someone whose opinion he valued. He came out of the kitchen when she pulled in, which he hadn't done the first time. "The shoulder from the first lot," he said. "I served it at a private dinner. Governor's aide was there." Magnolia lifted a crate from the wagon and handed it to the kitchen boy. "How was it received?" "He asked me where I sourced it," Hauptmann said. "I told him Boone Smokehouse, Calhoun County." He wrote it down. He paused, and she could see that he was working up to saying something he wasn't sure how to say. "I had another supplier approach me last week, offering smoked product at 15% below your price." She set another crate down and looked at him. "And?" "I told him I wasn't interested." He crossed his arms. "I want you to know that." She held his look. "I appreciate that." "Don't appreciate it," he said. "Just keep sending me shoulder cuts." She drove to the freight provisioner next. He received the delivery with the attention of a man who was calculating something, which he was, and then he said, "I've got 3 more hotels asking about pork products. Supply is unreliable out of the eastern distributors. Can you scale up by summer?" "Depends on what I can source in the spring," she said. "Retired breeders again?" "Probably." He looked at the delivery for a moment. "I told a man in Omaha about your product last week. He handles provisioning for 2 rail lines." He said it neutrally, as if he was just reporting a fact. "He's going to write to you." She drove home through the snow with an empty wagon and a head full of arithmetic. Scale. The word had been sitting at the back of her mind since October. Since before October, actually. Since she had first understood what the Smokehouse could do if it had sufficient volume behind it. But scale required animals, which required money she didn't have yet. And it required a second and potentially third processing cycle running simultaneously, which required people who knew what they were doing, and it required her to stop being the only person who truly understood every part of the operation. That last part was the one that made her stomach tighten, not from fear of sharing knowledge, but from the specific fear of the person who had been alone with something for so long that sharing it felt like releasing a grip she couldn't be sure she could get back. She thought about what Ruth had said, surviving versus knowing. She thought about Clara in the second smokehouse, checking temperatures without being asked, adjusting the damper in the right direction the first time because she'd been paying attention. She thought about the note that had been sent to Fisk, the way information moved in this county, the way the Hendricks partnership already knew her name. She had until March, maybe 6 weeks. Otto came by 2 weeks into February with the supply run, and with the particular expression he wore when he had information, he was deciding whether to volunteer. She had learned to watch for this expression. She waited until he'd finished handing down the salt and the grain supplements before she said, "What is it?" He looked at her. "Dale Gruber was in the feed store yesterday." "He's usually in the feed store." "I was asking about your animals. How many you had left, what condition they were in." Otto set down the last crate. He was talking to Hendricks' man. She had not seen that combination before. Gruber and Hendricks together was a different arrangement than either of them alone, and the arithmetic of it was not good. Gruber had the relationship with Fisk. Gruber had been watching her property since October. If Gruber was talking to the Hendricks partnership about what she had built here, it meant someone was thinking about what the Boone property was worth now that it wasn't distressed anymore, which was a different calculation than what it had been worth in the fall. "Did he see you?" she said. "I don't think he knew I'd tell you," Otto said, which was not quite the same thing. She thanked him and went inside and sat at the kitchen table and tried to think clearly about what it meant. The debt to Fisk was still the immediate problem, 6 weeks away. She had the February income, she had the projection for the remaining animals, she had the margin she'd been holding on to. The numbers said she could make the March payment. The numbers still said that. But if Gruber had decided that the Boone property was worth acquiring at forced sale price, and if he had Fisk in that conversation, and if Fisk decided that a modified payment schedule was suddenly in the bank's interest, there were things that could happen to a note that were technically legal and deeply unfair, and that she had seen happen to other properties in the county, including the Weatherby place, where the timeline had shifted by 30 days in a way that turned a manageable situation into an impossible one. She needed to make the payment before March, ahead of schedule. Enough ahead that there was no window for manipulation. She went back through the numbers. She looked for every dollar she could move forward. She thought about the Omaha contact the freight provisioner had mentioned, who had written to her and was waiting for a response about provisioning 2 rail lines. She had been going to write back after the March payment from a position of security. Now she thought about whether she could accelerate that conversation. She wrote a letter to the Omaha contact that evening. Straight, specific, without trying to make the operation sound larger than it was. "Here's what I can produce. Here's the quality. Here's what I need in exchange." She offered a small first delivery at a price that was below what she'd charge later, because she understood that rail line provisioners needed to taste before they committed, and because even a small payment arriving early was worth more to her right now than a larger one arriving in April. She sealed the letter and gave it to Otto in the morning to carry to the post in Grover. Clara came that afternoon and found Magnolia in the first smokehouse making adjustments to the firebox that didn't strictly need making. She had come there the way she sometimes came when she was agitated, not to do necessary work, but to be in the space that made the most sense to her. "I heard something," Clara said. She stood in the doorway with the cold air coming in around her. "About Gruber." Otto already told me. Not what Otto told you. She came inside and pulled the door nearly closed. Mother has a cousin in Grover, works at the courthouse. He said there was a conversation between Fisk's office and a lawyer named Prescott, not the Prescott who helped build this smokehouse, a different one, a younger one, about reviewing the terms of property notes in cases of what he called insufficient progress towards settlement. Magnolia was quiet for a moment. Did he say which properties? He didn't name any, but the conversation happened 2 days after Gruber met with the Hendricks man. She pressed her hand flat against the stone wall of the smokehouse. The stone was warm from the fire. She stayed like that for a moment, feeling the heat move through her palm. How long does a note review take? She said. He didn't know. A week, maybe 2. She did the arithmetic. If Fisk initiated a review now and used it to adjust the payment terms, she might be looking at a deadline that moved from March to February. She had the February income. She did not have the full March payment yet. She was 12 days short and had been planning for those 12 days to come from the last processing cycle. I need 12 days, she said. Clara said nothing, which was Clara's version of saying, tell me what you need. I need to move the last cycle forward, which means I need to process 2 animals that I was going to hold another week. She thought about it. They'll come in light, not ideal. How light? Maybe 8% below where I wanted them. She paused. The quality will still be there. The yield will just be lower than I'd planned. Then do it, Clara said. Better 80% of a good thing than nothing. 80% of a good thing is still going to be good. Magnolia took her hand off the wall. I know, She stopped. You hate compromising. I hate compromising on things that don't need to be compromised. This needs to be, Clara said. This one time. She wasn't wrong. Magnolia knew she wasn't wrong. This was exactly the kind of situation her father had told her about, when she'd been young and had asked him why he sometimes did things differently than he'd planned. Because the plan meets the world, Maggie, and the world always has its own opinion. She hadn't fully understood it then. She understood it now. She moved the cycle forward. The 2 animals she processed ahead of schedule came out exactly as she'd projected. Slightly lighter than ideal. The yield 8% below what she'd been targeting, but the quality was there. The cure was right. The smoke had done what the smoke was supposed to do. She wrapped the cuts with the same care she brought to everything, checked them twice, set them aside. The Omaha contact wrote back 4 days later. He wanted the delivery. He offered a number that was lower than she'd have asked for in April, but was real money arriving now. She wrote back accepting. She arranged shipment through the freight provisioner, who raised his eyebrows slightly at the timeline, but made no objection. The payment arrived 8 days before she'd expected it. She sat at the kitchen table with the money and her ledger and the payment schedule and added everything up for the last time. She had enough. Not just enough. She had the full March payment plus $19 over. The $19 was the most important money she had ever held, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant, which was that she had not just survived to the deadline. She had arrived before it. She drove to Grover the next morning. It was a Monday, gray and cold, the kind of morning that said February was almost done but wasn't done yet. She went directly to the bank and asked for Arthur Fisk, who came out from his office with his coat buttoned and his expression doing the thing it always did, where it suggested mild disappointment as a baseline state. She put the payment on his desk, full amount, ahead of schedule. He counted it. He counted it again. He made a notation in his ledger. Then he looked up at her. This settles the February note, he said. He had called it the February note. She noticed that. March note, she said. The one in March. A pause. Yes, he said. Of course. March. He wrote out the receipt and handed it to her, and she folded it carefully and put it inside her coat. Is there anything else? She said. He looked at her for a moment. The Hendricks partnership has expressed interest in several properties in the county, he said carefully, including properties adjacent to yours. Adjacent to mine, she said. They're prepared to offer fair market value. I'm sure they are. She buttoned her coat. My property isn't adjacent to mine. It is mine, and it's not for sale. She met his eyes. Is there anything else? There wasn't. She walked out of the bank into the cold Grover Street and stood on the boardwalk for a moment. Across the street, the feed store had its doors open. She could see 2 men inside, their backs to her. She didn't recognize them from this distance. It didn't matter. She had a receipt in her coat and an empty wagon and 43 remaining sows in a back pasture in Calhoun County, and she needed to get home because the afternoon feeding was at 4 and the temperature was dropping. She was 3 blocks from the bank when she heard her name. She turned. A man was coming out of the hotel across the street, walking quickly, not quite running. He was a stranger. She was sure she'd never seen him before. Heavy-set, expensively dressed for this county, carrying a leather case that had the quality of something purchased in a city where they charged more for leather than Nebraska did. "Miss Boone," he said again, reaching her. He was slightly out of breath. "I was hoping to catch you. My name is Aldous Crane. I'm with Crane and Associates, provisioning out of Omaha." He produced a card and held it out. "I believe you've been in correspondence with my associate, Gerald Thatch." She took the card. She looked at it. "Mr. Thatch received a delivery last week," she said. "He did." Crane seemed like a man who was accustomed to conducting business quickly, to getting to the point before the other person had time to prepare defenses. He was extremely impressed, as was the rail line's kitchen manager, whom he had taste the product before committing. He paused. "I'm in Grover for 2 days. I'd like to come out to your property, if that's possible, tomorrow." "Why?" she said. He looked momentarily thrown, which suggested people didn't often ask him why. "To understand the operation, the scale, the process." He glanced at the card she was still holding. "We have provisioning contracts with 4 rail lines. We've been looking for a consistent pork supplier in this region for 3 years. Every operation we've approached either can't meet the volume or can't hold the quality, sometimes both." She looked at him for a long moment. He was nervous, she realized. He was trying not to show it, but he was nervous, which meant he wanted something more than he was letting on, which meant she had something he needed. "Tomorrow at 10, she said. "You know where the Boone property is?" "I'll find it," he said. She drove home into the gray afternoon and tried to think about what Aldous Crane's visit meant without letting herself run too far ahead of the facts. He was a provisioner from Omaha with rail line contracts. He'd tasted her product and come to Grover specifically. Those were the facts. Everything else was speculation. But the speculation was pointing at something large. She told Clara that evening because Clara was at the property finishing a check of the second Smokehouse. And because she had learned over the past 3 months that Clara's thinking on practical matters was worth including. "Rail lines," Clara said. 4 of them, he said. Clara was quiet for a moment. She was doing the same arithmetic Magnolia was doing. "That's not the same as the hotel. That's not even the same as the freight routes." "No," Magnolia said. "That's—" Clara stopped. Started again. "That's a different size of thing." "Yes." "Can you do it?" She had been asking herself that question since she'd watched Crane walk back into the hotel. Could she do it? What would doing it require? More animals, which meant the spring auction. More processing capacity, which meant possibly a 3rd smokehouse or modifications to the existing 2. More hands, which meant bringing in people she'd have to train. More of everything. "I don't know yet," she said. It was the most honest answer. "I need to hear what he's actually proposing before I know what I'd need." "But you're not going to say no," Clara said. It wasn't quite a question. Magnolia thought about the $19 over the payment. She thought about the receipt in her coat. She thought about walking out of Fisk's office and the particular quality of the air on the street, how it had felt different at 32 degrees than it had felt the day before at 32 degrees. "I'm not going to say no," she said. Crane arrived at 10 the next morning in a good horse and a rented buggy and stood at the gate looking at the property with the expression of someone revising their expectations. She had noticed this before. People who had heard about the Boone Smokehouse and arrived expecting something more imposing, then found the quiet reality of a working farm in winter and didn't know quite what to do with it. She showed him the first smokehouse. She showed him the process, walked him through the temperature control, the wood selection, the stages of the salt cure. She did not oversell any of it. She described what it was. A method developed over years, refined, consistent, dependent on patience and on good raw material and on refusing to rush. He asked intelligent questions. She appreciated that. The wrong questions would have told her he was the kind of buyer who wanted to squeeze down costs by squeezing the process, and that was not a conversation she was interested in having. His questions were about method and about consistency and about what happened when something went wrong, which was exactly what she'd want to know if she were trying to understand whether an operation could hold up at scale. He asked about the pigs specifically. Retired breeders, he said, in a tone that was neutral rather than skeptical. Gerald mentioned it. I wasn't sure I understood correctly. Most people don't, she said. The age matters. The marbling is different. The collagen content changes the texture in the cure in a way that younger animals can't replicate. She paused. You tasted it. I did, he said. Did you notice the texture on the shoulder cut? He had. She could see it in his face, the memory of it. It wasn't like anything I've had from a commercial supplier, he said. It was, he searched for the word. Dense, she said. Without being heavy. Yes. He looked at her. Exactly that. She took him to see the remaining animals. He stood at the pasture fence and looked at them the way she had stood at the fence after the auction, and she could see him trying to understand what he was seeing, which was 43 old sows who had been fed carefully through a Nebraska winter, and who looked nothing like the worthless animals the county had watched her buy in October. Where do you source them? He said. Auctions, farm sales, places where people are liquidating. She crossed her arms against the cold. No one wants them. That's the point. How many can you get in a season? Depends on the season, she said. This spring I'm expecting to attend 3 auctions. The county's got more liquidating operations than it had 2 years ago. She didn't name the Hendricks partnership. She didn't need to. I was quiet for a moment. If I contracted a volume, a specific quarterly volume, could you hold to it? Depends on the volume, she said, and the timeline. By summer, he said. Beginning of the rail season. She did the arithmetic in her head. It was not simple arithmetic. It involved the spring auctions, the feed schedule, the processing timeline, the capacity of 2 smokehouses, and possibly a third, the question of who would run the third if she built it. It involved Ruth Henley and Clara, and whether they could train someone else, and whether she trusted anyone else to learn what took her years to know. Walk me through your number, she said, the quarterly volume you have in mind. He told her. She kept her face still. It was a large number, not impossible. She could see the path to it, the way she could always see the path when the pieces were laid out. But it was large enough that the path involved things she hadn't done yet, and a few things she wasn't sure she could do. Building a 3rd smokehouse, attending more auctions, training additional help, holding quality at volume, which was the part that frightened her most because quality was the thing she controlled when she was doing everything herself, and the thing she feared losing control of when the operation grew beyond her direct hands. Give me the morning to think, she said. Come back at noon and I'll tell you what I can offer. He looked surprised again, used to people saying yes while he was still in the room. Miss Boone, I have a train at 3 o'clock. Then we'll have lunch, she said. I'll have an answer for you by noon. She walked him back to the gate and watched him drive toward Grover, and then she went directly to the kitchen table and got out the paper and the pencil and started writing numbers. Clara came by at 11, which was either coincidence or Ruth had told her to, and found Magnolia at the table surrounded by paper. How big? Clara said. Magnolia showed her the number. Clara sat down. Can we do it? Magnolia said. Clara looked at the papers. She was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that meant she was actually working through it rather than just reacting to the size of the number. If we build the 3rd smokehouse by May, she said slowly. If you can get close to the volume at the spring auctions, if we train someone for the 3rd operation, if... She stopped. There are a lot of ifs. There were a lot of ifs in October, Magnolia said. Clara looked at her. Yes, she said. There were. Magnolia looked at the numbers on the paper. She thought about the original math, the $41, the 47 sows, the thin but real margin she'd driven home with in October in the dark. She thought about the receipt in her coat. She thought about Fisk's face when she'd laid the full payment on his desk a week ahead of schedule. She thought about Dale Gruber's hand on her arm. Sit down, sweetheart. She picked up the pencil. Let's find the number I can actually commit to, she said. Not what I hope. What I know. They worked through it together until 11:45. Clara caught 2 errors in the feed cost projection that would have made the numbers look better than they were, and Magnolia corrected them without argument because wrong numbers that looked good were more dangerous than honest numbers that looked hard. They came out at the end with a figure that was smaller than what Crane had proposed and larger than what she'd have believed possible in October. She wrote it on a clean piece of paper and folded it and put it in her coat pocket. Crane came back at noon. She fed him cold biscuits and coffee because that was what she had, and because she was not going to pretend this was a social call. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the biscuits with the expression of a man who had expected something and gotten something else. And she did not apologize for the biscuits. She slid the paper across the table to him. He looked at the number. He looked at her. "This is less than I named." "It's what I can guarantee," she said. "I don't offer numbers I can't meet." "The difference is significant." "Yes," she said. "It is." She held his look. "I could give you the larger number, you might believe it. And then if I came in short, you'd have a provisioning problem with 4 rail lines, and I'd have a credibility problem I couldn't recover from." She paused. "Or I give you this number, I meet it exactly, and we have a conversation in the fall about what the following year looks like." He was quiet. He had the look of someone recalculating. "Hauptmann at the hotel," he said. "What about him?" "He said you turned down a premium for rush delivery in November. He told me this when I asked him for references." Crane set the paper down. "He seemed to think that was the most important thing to tell me." She looked at the paper on the table, the number she had written, the number she knew she could meet. "It was," she said. He picked up the paper and folded it and put it in his coat. "I'll have my associate send you a formal contract proposal," he said. "You'll want to have it reviewed before you sign." "I know what to look for," she said. He nodded. He finished his coffee. He put his hat on and stood, and then he said something she hadn't expected. "The man who asked me about this county," he said, "who told me there were provisioning opportunities here. He mentioned the Boone Smokehouse specifically. Said a woman named Boone was doing something different and I should look into it." She frowned. "Who was it?" Crane smiled briefly. "A freight driver. Said he'd tried to reserve a ham in November, and by the time he'd circled back it was already spoken for." He picked up his hat. He seemed quite put out about it. She walked him to the gate. She stood at the gate after he drove away and let the cold air move around her and tried to understand what she was feeling, which was not simple enough to name quickly. It had too many layers. The contract number, the spring planning, the third smokehouse, the conversation with Fisk, the receipt folded in her coat. It had the weight of things she hadn't let herself fully believe until they were real, and they were starting to be real now, and that was a different kind of weight than dread or uncertainty. Not lighter, just different. Across the pasture, the sows were moving in the afternoon gray, 43 of them, familiar now, in a way the 47 had not been in October. She knew their rhythms. She knew which ones came to the trough first and which ones hung back. She knew the gray-faced one she'd refused to name, and who she'd been calling Eleanor anyway, in the privacy of her own head, since the first night. Eleanor was in the middle of the herd, moving slowly, as she always did, with the deliberate weight of an animal who'd been somewhere and done something and wasn't in a hurry anymore. Magnolia watched her for a moment. Then she pushed away from the gate and went to start the afternoon feeding, because it was 4 o'clock and the temperature was dropping and she had work to do, and the work was not going to wait on her feelings about it, which was fine. The work was never going to wait. That had always been the thing about the work, and she had always been all right with that. The contract proposal from Crane and Associates arrived 12 days later, carried by Otto, along with the usual supplies, and a look on his face that suggested he understood the envelope was significant without knowing exactly why. Magnolia set it on his kitchen table and did not open it immediately. She finished the morning feeding first, checked the smokehouse temperatures, replaced a section of twine on the hanging rail in the second smokehouse that had been fraying for a week, and then came inside and made coffee and sat down and opened it. It was 6 pages. She read all 6 pages twice before she formed an opinion about any of it, which was the discipline her father had tried to instill in her about any document that had money and time attached to it. Read everything before you react to anything, Maggie. The thing that bothers you on page 1 usually gets explained on page 4, and if it doesn't, then it actually bothers you. The volume commitment was what she'd proposed. That part was clean. The price schedule was fair, not generous. She wasn't expecting generous from a provisioner who ran contracts with 4 rail lines, but fair and structured in a way that gave her predictability, which was worth more than a higher number that might shift. The payment terms were net 30, which she didn't love but could work with if the delivery schedule was staggered right. Page 4 was where it got complicated. There was a clause on page 4, buried in a paragraph about quality standards, that gave Crane and Associates the right to conduct unannounced inspections of the production facility at any time during the contract period, and furthermore granted them authority to suspend delivery acceptance if the facility was found to be operating in a manner inconsistent with the quality standards outlined in Appendix B, which she turned to and found to be a list of specifications that were reasonable in every particular except one. They referenced a minimum facility size requirement that the current operation met by a narrow margin, and specified that if the operation changed in size or scope, the new configuration had to be approved by a crane representative before deliveries could resume. She read that part 3 times. What it meant, practically, was that if she built the third smokehouse, which she needed to build to meet the volume she'd committed to, she would need Crane's approval before she could use it, which meant Crane could delay her expansion, which meant Crane had written into the contract a structural advantage that she hadn't negotiated away because she hadn't seen it coming. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about Aldous Crane sitting across her kitchen table eating cold biscuits and saying he'd have his associate send her a formal proposal and that she'd want to have it reviewed. She had said she knew what to look for. She had missed page 4. This particular kind of anger, the kind directed at herself, was the worst kind. It was clean and deserved and offered no useful outlet. She let herself feel it for about 2 minutes, which was as long as she was going to give it, and then she got up and put on her coat and went to the Henley farm. Ruth was in the yard when she pulled in, and one look at Magnolia's face told her enough that she called for Clara without asking what was wrong. They sat at the kitchen table again. This was where the real work happened. Magnolia had come to understand, not in the smokehouses, but in this kitchen, around this table, where Ruth's practical intelligence and Clara's precise arithmetic combined with whatever it was Magnolia brought, which was knowledge and stubbornness and the refusal to be outmaneuvered twice by the same person. She explained the clause on page 4. Ruth listened without expression. Clara read the actual page, which Magnolia had brought, and her eyes moved over it twice the same way Magnolia's had. "He's not wrong to want inspection rights," Clara said slowly. "If he's contracting a specific quality—" "I don't object to inspection rights," Magnolia said. "I object to the expansion approval clause. That's not quality control. That's control." "Yes," Ruth said. She said it simply, like it was obvious, which it was once you'd seen it. "He wants to be able to decide how big you get. Or slow it down if it suits him," Magnolia said. "If he finds another supplier who's cheaper and needs a reason to delay my production while he transitions, he has one, written into the contract." Clara set the paper down. "Can you negotiate it out?" "I can try," Magnolia said. "The question is whether he'll walk if I push on it." "Would that be the worst thing?" Ruth said. Magnolia looked at her. It was a fair question and a hard one. The Crane contract was not the only path forward. She knew that. She had known it since before Crane appeared on the Grover Street. But it was the clearest path to the scale she'd been calculating toward, and turning it down meant returning to a smaller operation that was sustainable, but would never be what she could see it becoming. "No," she said finally. "It wouldn't be the worst thing, but I'd like to not find out." She wrote back to Crane that afternoon. She was specific, and she was not apologetic about it. She identified the clause on page 4, explained precisely why it was unacceptable, and proposed replacement language that preserved his inspection rights and his quality standards while removing the expansion approval requirement. She also proposed a modification to the payment terms, net 15 instead of net 30 on the first 2 deliveries, with reversion to net 30 after the relationship was established, as a gesture of good faith that also happened to improve her cash flow during the spring building period. She read the letter twice, changed 2 words, and sealed it. Otto took it the next morning. While she waited for the response, which she told herself could take 2 weeks and probably would, and she should not spend those 2 weeks thinking about it, which meant she spent them thinking about it, she moved forward on everything she could move forward on without the contract. The spring auction calendar was already taking shape. She had learned, through Otto and through the network of small information that ran through the county, like groundwater, that 3 farms in the region were planning liquidations in March and April. One of them was a pork operation that had been moderately sized at its peak, which meant older breeding stock that might have been well managed, which meant potential quality animals rather than just volume. She wrote to the operation owner directly, a man named Sutter, who she had never met but whose property she knew by reputation, and asked if he was planning to take his animals to auction or would consider a private sale. She had never done a private sale before. She wasn't sure she could afford it, which was the same position she'd been in at the October auction, and she had learned by now that being unsure whether she could afford something and ultimately affording it were 2 distinct states connected by calculation and work. Sutter wrote back in 5 days, which was faster than she'd expected, and said he had 32 animals he'd been planning to auction, and he was open to a conversation about alternatives. He was tired, his letter said, in the way that men wrote when they were tired of something they'd done for 30 years and were ready to be done with it. She recognized that tiredness. It was the same tiredness she'd heard in Harlan Getz's voice at the October auction when he'd said her father's animals weren't worthless and people just didn't know how to look. She went to see Sutter on a Thursday in late February, driving the 12 miles to his property on roads that were still partly frozen, hard enough to hold but with the surface beginning to go soft at the edges where the sun hit. Sutter was in his 60s, lean in a way that suggested he'd always been lean rather than that age had reduced him. And he came out to meet her in the yard with the particular wariness of a man who'd heard about her from someone and wasn't sure what to make of what he'd heard. She could see the animals from the gate. Even from that distance, she could tell they'd been well kept. "Your stock looks good," she said. "Always has," he said. It wasn't a boast, just a fact. "Heard you do something particular with retired breeders." "I do," she said. "Heard you bought old Harlan's lot in October for $41. And that Dale Gruber laughed at you for it." "He did." Sutter looked at her for a moment. "Dale Gruber's laughed at a lot of things over the years," he said. "Most of them turned out fine regardless." He turned toward the pasture. "Come look at them." She looked at all 32. She took her time. She did the same thing she'd done in October. The looking that tried to see not what an animal was, but what it could become in the right conditions. And by the time she'd gone through the lot, she had a number in her head that was lower than she wanted to pay and higher than she could comfortably afford. "I'll give you this," she said, and told him the number. He was quiet for a moment. "Auction would get me more." "Auction would get you more if the buyers value them," she said. "At auction, these animals are sausage stock. I'm offering you what I'd pay for animals I'm going to do something better with." He looked at her. "What if I told you that's not enough?" "I'd say I understand, and I'd go to the auction and bid against everyone else. And I'd probably end up paying more than this number and less than you'd get if the bidding went your way." She paused. "Or I'd miss them entirely." Another silence. "What do you do with them?" he said. Specifically. She told him. She walked him through it. The feed, the finish, the smokehouse process. What old, well-managed breeding stock produced that nothing else could. She wasn't pitching him. She was just describing it, the same way she described it to anyone who actually wanted to know, without decoration. He listened the way a man listened when the thing being described made sense to him. He'd spent 30 years with these animals. He understood what she was saying at a level that most buyers never would. 20 more than your number, he said. She thought about it. 10 more, she said, and I haul them myself today, so you don't have to feed them through the week waiting for the auction. He stuck out his hand. She drove home with 32 additional animals and a schedule problem she hadn't entirely solved yet, and enough momentum to carry her over the worry about whether it was going to work, which was not the same as knowing it was going to work, but had to be enough for now. The crane response arrived 10 days after she'd sent her revision. She was in the first smokehouse when Otto called to her from the yard, and she came out still smelling of hickory smoke to find him holding the envelope with the Omaha return address. She opened it there, in the yard, in the cold, which was not how she'd planned to do it. Crane had accepted the expansion clause revision. He had not accepted the payment term modification. Net 30 stood, which she had expected, but he had added a sentence to the quality inspection provision that limited inspections to no more than 4 per year with 14 days' notice, which was better than what the original contract had given her. He'd written a single line at the bottom of the cover letter, in handwriting rather than typescript. I was advised by Gerald that you don't agree to numbers you can't meet. I've decided to believe that. She folded the letter and put it in her coat. She went back into the smokehouse and finished what she'd been doing. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table and signed the contract in 3 places and dated it and sealed it for Otto to carry in the morning, and then she sat there for a while longer with her hands flat on the table and let herself understand what she'd just done, which was to commit to something large enough that the failure of it would not be recoverable. She had been building toward commitments of this size since October. She had been building toward them longer than that, if she was honest. But there was a difference between building toward a thing and signing your name to it, and she was sitting with that difference now. She was not calm about it. She wanted to be calm about it, and she wasn't. She was something closer to afraid, which was information she respected even when she didn't enjoy it. Fear meant something real was at stake. She had learned not to be run by it, but she'd also learned not to pretend it wasn't there. She went to bed and stared at the dark ceiling for about an hour before she slept. The spring arrived in the gradual, unreliable way of Nebraska springs, where warm days appeared and then retreated and appeared again, each one a little more persistent than the last, until one morning she woke and the air through the window had a different quality, and she understood that winter was done, even though the nights would still be cold for weeks. She had been waiting for this. The ground thawing meant the third smokehouse site was workable. She had chosen the location over the winter, a northwest-facing slope on the far side of the first smokehouse, where the earth was deep enough, and the drainage was right, and the prevailing wind would carry the smoke away from the house rather than toward it. She had drawn it on paper through the January evenings, working from memory of what the first smokehouse had been before her father modified it, planning the changes she would make based on what she'd learned running two operations simultaneously. Clara had been involved in the planning from the beginning, which had shifted something in the nature of their arrangement that Magnolia was still figuring out how to name. It had started as instruction, moved to collaboration, and was now something that had less to do with who knew more and more to do with two people working on the same problem from different angles. Clara's precision caught things Magnolia's intuition missed. Magnolia's instinct for the process gave Clara's planning something to be precise about. They disagreed regularly and productively, which Magnolia had learned was the sign of a working partnership rather than a performing one. They disagreed about the third smokehouse on the question of the firebox design. Magnolia wanted to replicate the first firebox as closely as possible, because the first firebox worked, and she understood its behavior completely. Clara thought the replicated design had an inefficiency in the draft that she'd identified from watching the second smokehouse, which was built from the Henley root cellar and had different airflow characteristics than the Hill-Dug original. "You're not wrong about the draft," Magnolia said. They were standing at the marked site on a cold March morning, looking at the staked outline of the planned structure. "But I know how to manage that draft. I've been managing it for 7 years." "You've been managing around it," Clara said. "That's different. If you're running 3 smokehouses and something goes wrong with the third one's draft at 2 in the morning, you want it to behave the way you expect, which is why I want it built the same as the first. But if we adjust the intake position by 8 inches, Clara, you get cleaner airflow through the full chamber without needing to compensate on the damper, which means—" "Clara," she stopped. 8 inches, Magnolia said. "Show me where." Clara showed her. Magnolia looked at the staked position and the proposed alternative position and worked through it in her head, the way the air would move, the way the heat would distribute, and she saw what Clara was describing and also saw the 2 ways it could go wrong, and she said so. Clara looked at the 2 failure modes. "Adjustable secondary damper," she said, "here and here." Magnolia looked at where she was pointing. The adjustment added cost and complexity. It also solved both failure modes she'd identified. She stood there in the cold doing the calculation of whether she trusted her own resistance to this idea, whether it was based on something real or on the particular stubbornness she sometimes had about things she'd always done a certain way. "Fine," she said. 8 inches. And the secondary damper." Clara nodded. She didn't look triumphant, which Magnolia appreciated. She just looked like someone whose idea had been accepted and who was already thinking about the next problem. The building took 3 weeks. It was the hardest physical work Magnolia had done since taking over the farm. Harder than the October fence work, harder than the first smokehouse cleaning, because this was building rather than repairing, and building required decisions at every stage while repairing required matching what was already there. Ruth helped with the masonry on the first 5 days, and then her knee gave out in a way she described as inconvenient, but that looked to Magnolia like significant pain, and she sent Ruth home and told her to stay there. "I'm fine," Ruth said. "You're limping," Magnolia said. "I've been limping for 3 years. Not like that." She helped Ruth onto the wagon seat. "Clara and I will finish it. I'll send word when it's ready." Ruth looked at her for a moment. She seemed about to argue and then didn't, which told Magnolia the knee was worse than Ruth was saying. "Don't let Clara put the capstones on without me," Ruth said. "I want to be there for that." "Deal," Magnolia said. She and Clara worked the remaining days together, longer hours than either of them had planned, starting before the light was good and stopping after it was gone. There was a quality to that work that Magnolia recognized as the same quality she'd sometimes felt in the smokehouse alone, the narrowing of everything to the task at hand, The way time moved differently when the work was physical and required full attention, the strange piece of it. They didn't talk much. When they did, it was about the work. At one point, late in the second week, when they'd been hauling stone for 2 hours and neither of them had said anything for 40 minutes, Clara said, "My mother thinks you're going to be somebody people know about." Magnolia set a stone down. "In the county?" "Beyond the county." Clara set her stone down too and straightened. "She doesn't say things like that lightly." "I know." Magnolia looked at the wall they'd built that afternoon. It was not elegant work. She was a better smoker than she was a mason, but it was solid. "Tell her I'm trying to get through the spring first." "She knows," Clara said. "She said that's how it always starts." Ruth came back for the capstones on a warm April afternoon, knee still wrapped but limping less, and they set the last stones together, the three of them, which was the right way to do it, and which none of them said out loud because they didn't need to. Magnolia fired the third smokehouse for the first time that evening, burning just wood with no meat yet, watching the smoke rise and the temperature build and checking the draft behavior at every stage with the attention of someone who needed to know this specific fire, its specific personality, before she trusted it with anything that mattered. Clara had been right about the 8 inches. The airflow was cleaner. It was visibly, measurably cleaner. She adjusted the secondary damper twice to confirm she understood how it behaved, and then left it in the position that felt right and went home to sleep. The spring auction season arrived in the same week the third smokehouse came online. She attended the first auction in mid-April with Ruth, who came along because she understood animals, and because she had decided, without being asked, that she was part of this operation now in a way that the original buttermilk arrangement hadn't exactly specified, but that had become the reality anyway. They drove together in the early morning, before the ground had fully warmed, and Ruth talked about her husband the way she rarely talked about him. Not with grief exactly, more with the specific fond exasperation of someone who had loved a difficult person and knew it clearly in retrospect. "He'd have liked you," Ruth said, somewhere on the road. "Would he have told me that?" Magnolia said. Ruth laughed, short and genuine. "Absolutely not." She looked out at the passing fields. "He showed people things by watching what they did. If he liked you, you'd find him showing up when you needed help and not explaining why." "That sounds familiar," Magnolia said, glancing at her. Ruth looked straight ahead. "Drive," she said. The first auction was in a county south of Calhoun, which meant a different crowd, different auctioneers, a different set of assumptions about who she was when she walked in. She preferred this, in a way. No accumulated story to fight against, just a woman bidding on animals. So bid on 40 animals and got 26. The other 14 went to a buyer she didn't recognize who seemed to want volume, regardless of quality, which was fine. She didn't need all of them and couldn't have managed all of them. The 26 she brought home were in better condition than she'd hoped. The operation that had liquidated them had been careful, and careful operations left careful animals. The second auction, 2 weeks later, was in Calhoun County. She had known this one would be different. It was the regular spring sale, the same venue as the October auction where she'd spent her $41, and Dale Gruber had put his hand on her arm and the crowd had laughed. She had been thinking about it since February with the specific ambivalence of something you couldn't avoid and weren't sure you wanted to avoid. She arrived early. The yard was already filling. She took a spot near the fence and watched people arrive and felt the quality of the attention differently than she had in October. Still there, still that calculating look, but the calculation had changed. She could see it in the people who made eye contact and the people who didn't, in the particular way conversations near her went slightly quieter when she moved past. She had made the Fisk payment. She had signed the crane contract. She had 3 smokehouses running on her property and orders through Summer and Hauptmann at the hotel, sending people out from Grover to see if she had anything not already spoken for. The county knew all of this in the way the county knew things. Imperfectly, partially, with the particular distortion of information that had passed through several people before it arrived anywhere. Dale Gruber was there. She saw him across the yard and he saw her at approximately the same time, and she watched him make the decision about how to handle it, which took about 3 seconds and came out as a nod. Not warm, not performative. A nod that acknowledged her existence without conceding anything specific. She nodded back. He walked over. She had not expected this and kept her expression neutral while she arranged herself for the conversation. "Miss Boone," he said. "Mr. Gruber." He looked at the yard, not at her. His thumbs were in his belt, the posture of a man thinking about something. I heard you made the Fisk payment early. I did. And the crane contract. She said nothing. Word gets around, he said, which was not news to her. Another pause. She waited. I've got 4 retired sows, he said, from the North operation. They were breeders, good ones. He still wasn't looking at her. I was going to auction them today, but he stopped. Then, what are you paying? She looked at him. She made sure she had understood the question correctly because it was a question she hadn't predicted. Dale Gruber, asking her what she was paying. Dale Gruber, standing in the same yard where he had grabbed her arm and told her to sit down, asking her if she'd buy his animals. She felt something move through her that was complicated enough that she needed a moment to let it settle. It was not triumph, not exactly, though there was something in that vicinity. It was more like the feeling of a very long piece of work reaching a point where you could finally measure it against something real. Depends on the animals, she said. I'd need to see them. I can bring them by, he said. Tomorrow, if you're around. I'm around, she said. He nodded and walked away, and she stood at the fence and breathed in the spring air that smelled of the stockyard and the turned earth of the surrounding fields. And thought about October, the specific cold of that October morning, the $41 in the coffee tin, the sound of laughter carrying across this same yard. It's a bit on livestock through the rest of the morning. She got 14 animals from 3 different lots, which was less than she'd projected and more than she needed immediately, and the prices were higher than October had been because apparently someone in the county had started paying attention to what retired breeders were worth. She was reasonably sure she knew who had started that particular conversation. She drove home with 14 sows in a wagon that handled better than the borrowed October wagon with its bad left wheel, because she had fixed the wagon in February with money that had not existed in October, and that felt like its own kind of accounting. Gruber came the next day with 4 animals in a small trailer pulled behind his horse, and she looked at each one carefully and asked him 2 questions about their breeding history and told him a number. He tried to push it up. She told him why the number was what it was, specifically, and he listened with the expression of someone hearing a language they didn't speak fluently but could partially follow. He accepted the number. While she was signing the bill of sale, he said, without looking up, that day at the auction, in October. She waited. I was out of line, he said. He said it the way men said things they'd been working up to for a while, not smoothly, but real. The way I spoke to you. She looked at him. She took her time. Yes, she said. You were. He nodded. That was all, on both sides. It was not a reconciliation and not a friendship and not a resolution of the underlying dynamic, which was a man who had paid her father $800 for $1,200 land and who had been watching her property all winter with intentions she still didn't entirely trust. But it was something. An acknowledgement from a man who didn't acknowledge things easily, which meant it cost him something, and things that cost people something were worth receiving. She kept the signed bill of sale. The operation through April and May was the most demanding stretch of running she'd experienced because she had 3 smokehouses and 4 significant buyer relationships and the spring animal intake happening simultaneously, and the management of all of those things required a level of coordination that was beyond what she could carry alone. She had known this was coming. She had prepared for it by developing Clara, by building the processes she'd built, by refusing to let any part of the operation exist only in her own head. But knowing something is going to be hard and being inside the heart of it are different things. There was a Thursday in early May where everything seemed to be going wrong at once, in the particular cascading way that problems had when they arrived together. A delivery that came in short because of a road washout, a temperature problem in the 3rd smokehouse that took 6 hours to diagnose and turned out to be the secondary damper set wrong by ½ an inch. A letter from Crane's office about the first quarterly delivery logistics that required immediate response, and one of the new spring sows showing signs of respiratory illness that meant she spent 2 hours in the holding pen doing for this animal what she'd done for the gray-faced gate sow back in October. By 7 in the evening, she was at the kitchen table with the logistics letter and a cup of cold coffee she'd forgotten to drink, and her arithmetic on 3 pages, and the slow, grinding fatigue of a day that had required her to make too many decisions too quickly, some of which might have been wrong. Clara appeared at the door at 7:15. She had not been expected. Mother sent food, she said. She came in without being invited because that was how their arrangement had evolved, and set a covered pot on the stove. Also, she wanted to know if you'd sorted the draft problem. Fixed it at 4 o'clock, Magnolia said. She thought you had. She said you get a certain look when you've solved something. Clara took the cold coffee cup from in front of Magnolia and replaced it with a glass of water. What else? Crane's logistics letter. I saw it. He wants to move the June delivery by a week. I know. I'm trying to figure out if that works with the current cycle timing. It does, Claire said. If you start the second batch in the third smokehouse on Monday instead of Wednesday, I already mapped it. Magnolia looked at her. When did you do that? This afternoon while you were in the holding pen with the sick sow. Clara sat down across from her. You were going to figure this out in another hour. I just figured it out faster because I wasn't in the holding pen. Magnolia looked at the letters and the arithmetic and the glass of water Clara had put in front of her. I need to write back to Crane tonight. Write it tomorrow, Clara said. The decision is made. The letter can wait until you've slept. She pushed the water closer. Drink that. Magnolia drank it. She was too tired to argue. The sick sow, Clara said. How bad? Early stage. I caught it early. She paused. Probably. What are you doing for her? Same thing I did in October. Warm mash, herbs, monitoring. She looked at her hands on the table. I hate losing animals. I know the math of it, and I know losing one animal in a herd this size doesn't change the operation. I hate it anyway. I know, Clara said. My father felt the same way. He said it meant you were paying attention. He was right. They sat in the kitchen in the quiet of the early evening, the pot warming on the stove, the lamp making a small circle of yellow light on the table. Outside the window, the May dark was coming on slow, the way it did now that the days had lengthened, the sky still holding a thin line of light along the western edge. I've been thinking about something, Clara said. Magnolia waited. The operation is too big for the current arrangement. You know that. Yes. Whatever we've been calling this, she gestured between them. It needs to be something real, written down, with terms. Magnolia looked at her. A partnership. If that's what you want to call it. Clara met her look steadily. I'm not asking for charity, and I'm not asking for more than I've earned. But I need to know what I'm building is mine to build, not just help. It was a fair thing to say. It was a thing Magnolia had known was coming and had been putting off the formal version of because formalizing it required acknowledging how much had shifted from the original arrangement and how much she had come to rely on what Clara brought to the operation, and how different that was from the solitude she'd been managing since she was 19. I know what you've earned, Magnolia said. I've been counting it. What does it come to? More than I've been paying you. She said it directly. I'm going to fix that. With interest. She paused. And yes, partnership. Real terms, written down. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she got up and stirred the pot on the stove. Mother is going to be insufferable about this, she said. She's been saying it since December. I know, Magnolia said. She's going to act like she arranged it. She did arrange it, Magnolia said. She sent you to my property with straw bales I hadn't asked for. Clara didn't say anything to that. She served the food and they ate at the kitchen table and talked about the Monday schedule and the Crane delivery and what to watch for with the sick sow. And at some point the conversation shifted from work to the kind of talking that didn't have a purpose, except to fill the space comfortably, which Magnolia realized she had not done with anyone in this house since her father died. She noticed it without making something of it. It was just information, a thing that was different now from how it had been. After Clara left, she went out to check the sick sow one more time. The animal was lying in the clean straw, breathing steadily, the flank rising and falling at a rhythm that was less labored than it had been at noon. When Magnolia set her hand against the sow's side, the animal turned her head slightly, the movement of an animal that recognized a presence and didn't object to it. You're going to be fine, Magnolia said. She meant it as information, not reassurance. The animal's breathing was already better. She would monitor it for 2 more days, and she expected it to resolve cleanly, and she was almost certain she was right. Almost. She stood in the holding pen in the warm May night and listened to the sound of the operation all around her, the animals in the pasture, the faint smell of hickory carrying from the third smokehouse where the fire was banked low for the night, the distant sound of a wagon on the county road going somewhere she didn't need to know about. She had signed a contract with a provisioner in Omaha. She had 3 smokehouses and a real partnership and the respect of the county's livestock market, where retired breeding sows now sold for a price that hadn't existed before October. She had paid the note early and had $19 left over and had long since stopped thinking about the specific quality of that $19. Because there were other numbers now, larger numbers, real numbers, that kept arriving because she had built something that made them arrive. She had done all of this. She was also standing in a holding pen at 8 in the evening checking on a sick pig and hoping she wasn't wrong about the prognosis, because getting it wrong mattered, and she was still not sure she was right. Both of those things were equally true. She had learned to hold both of them at the same time, the accomplishment and the uncertainty, without letting either one crowd out the other. The uncertainty was not a failure of the accomplishment. It was the evidence that the accomplishment was real, that it was made of actual things that could go wrong, not a story about things that had worked out. The sow breathed, steady, slow. Magnolia stayed a few more minutes. Then she went inside, wrote the letter to Crane, and went to bed. The sick sow recovered by the end of the week. Magnolia had known she would, had said so out loud to Clara and to the animal herself, and had spent 3 nights checking the holding pen after dark anyway, because knowing something was probably going to be fine and being able to stop watching it were two different things, and she had never fully bridged that gap. On Friday morning, the sow walked out of the holding pen under her own momentum and inserted herself into the morning feeding with the aggressive confidence of an animal that had decided being sick was behind her and was not worth discussing further. Magnolia watched her go and felt the particular relief of a worry resolved, not the dramatic relief of a crisis averted, just the quiet deflation of something she'd been carrying setting itself down. She had other things to carry. The June delivery to Crane and Associates went out on schedule. She had loaded the wagon herself the night before, checking every piece the way she always checked, not because she didn't trust the process, but because the checking was itself part of the process. A final confirmation that what left her property was what she had agreed to send. Hauptmann received his standing order on the same day, and the freight provisioner's run went south on the Thursday. 3 deliveries in 1 week, the largest coordinated output the operation had produced, and it went without a problem significant enough to name, which was not the same as smooth. There was a moment with the wagon axle on the Grover Road that required 40 minutes of work on the shoulder with Clara holding the horse, but it went. Crane's acknowledgement arrived 12 days later. He wrote that the rail line kitchen managers had made specific requests for the shoulder cuts and the belly cure. He asked whether Boone Smokehouse could add a 4th quarterly delivery beginning in the fall. The number he proposed for the additional delivery was written on the same line as the question, which was the move of a man who knew the number would do most of his negotiating for him. She read it to Clara across the kitchen table. Clara set down her coffee. "Can we?" Magnolia thought about it. The spring animal intake had brought the herd to its largest size yet, 71 animals across the property at the current count. Managed between the main pasture and a secondary holding area, she'd expanded in April. 3 smokehouses running overlapping cycles. Clara managing the 2nd and 3rd operations with a level of independence that had grown so gradually Magnolia had barely noticed when it became real. The operation had a shape now, a momentum. 4 quarterly deliveries was not an impossibility. With one condition, Magnolia said. "What condition?" "We hire someone for the feeding and hauling. I can't manage the animal side at this volume and stay on top of the smokehouse work too." She had been thinking about this for 6 weeks, identifying the place where the structure was weakest, and the answer kept coming back to the same point. "I need someone reliable for the physical labor, not the smoking, just the feed and the water and the hauling." "Do you have someone in mind?" She did. There was a young man in the county named Dex Garfield, 20 years old, quiet, the son of a family that had lost their farm the previous fall to a different kind of debt than hers. He'd been working for various operations around the county on a day labor basis since October. She had watched him work twice, once helping Otto on a delivery and once at the spring auction, and he had the particular quality she valued most in anyone who worked with animals, which was that he paid attention to them rather than just managing them. She had spoken to him informally in April, nothing specific, just a conversation that established whether he was interested in regular work. He was. She'd told him she'd be in touch. She wrote to him that evening and offered terms, and he came out 3 days later and stood in the yard and looked at the operation with the same expression Crane had worn, that revision of expectations, and said yes without negotiating, which either meant the terms were fair or he was too young to know he could push, and she decided it meant the terms were fair. She wrote back to Crane accepting the 4th quarterly delivery. Ruth came to know about the Garfield hire before Magnolia had told her, because information in this county still moved the way it always had, and she came to the property on a Tuesday afternoon with the expression of someone who had an opinion she was considering whether to share. "He's 20, Ruth said. "I know how old he is," Magnolia said. "Is he capable?" "Yes." Ruth looked out at the pasture, where Dex was distributing feed at the far station with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had figured out the rhythm of the work and settled into it. "His father was a capable man," she said. "Bad with money. Dex is not his father." "No," Ruth agreed. "He's not." She watched him for another moment. "You're building something that needs people." "I know. That's different from what you've been doing." "I know that too," Magnolia said. Ruth looked at her. "Does it bother you?" She thought about it honestly because Ruth was the person she was honest with in that particular way. Not confessionally, not needing comfort, just accurately. "Some," she said. "Not the way I thought it would. I thought it would feel like losing control. It feels more like—" She stopped, searching for the right word. "Deciding what actually needs my hands on it, and what doesn't." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "My husband used to say that a farm that needs you for every single thing is a farm that's one bad day away from collapse." Smart man. He had his moments. Ruth turned from the fence. "Come inside. We need to talk about the fall auction calendar." The formal partnership agreement between Magnolia Boone and Clara Henley was signed on a Friday afternoon in late June at the kitchen table in the Boone farmhouse, with Ruth present as witness because Ruth had stated flatly that she was going to be present, and neither of them had seen any reason to argue. The document had been drawn up by a lawyer in Grover, not the Prescott who was connected to Fisk and Gruber, a different one, a woman named Marian Adler, who had been practicing in the county for 8 years, and who read the partnership terms with the kind of attention that suggested she was prepared to find problems and was slightly disappointed when she mostly didn't. Clara got 15% of net on the operations she managed directly, a pathway to 20% over 3 years, and her name on the letterhead, which Clara said she didn't need and which Magnolia put there anyway because a name on a letterhead was a different thing than a name in a verbal agreement, and she wanted Clara to have the real thing. They signed it, and Ruth poured 3 glasses of the blackberry wine she made in the fall, and they drank it at the kitchen table in the afternoon light coming through the window, and nobody made a speech because nobody needed to. "Your father would have liked this," Ruth said to Magnolia, not to fill the silence, just because it was true and worth saying. Magnolia held her glass and thought about Clement Boone, about the specific way he'd had of watching her work when she was learning, not hovering, just present, close enough that she knew he was watching and far enough that she understood she was doing it herself. She thought about the Smokehouse lesson at 9 years old, her hands cold and the salt rough under her palms, and her father's voice explaining something she hadn't fully understood until years after he was gone. "He would have had notes," she said, "about the firebox design." Ruth laughed. Clara smiled. It was the right kind of thing to say about a dead person. Specific enough to be true, affectionate enough to be kind, and honest enough that the loss in it was real without being performed. Summer moved across the Nebraska land in the way it did. Big, insistent, the heat building through July into something that required adjusting every part of the operation to account for it. Heat was the enemy of the curing process in a way that cold never quite was, because cold slowed things and slow was manageable, but heat accelerated the wrong processes, encouraged the bacteria she spent her life preventing, required her to monitor temperature more frequently and adjust more carefully and trust less to the rhythms she'd established through the fall and winter. She made 3 modifications to the first smokehouse ventilation in July. One of them made things better. One of them made things worse, which she identified within 2 days and reversed. One of them was ambiguous, and she left it in place and watched it through August to see what it did. She lost 2 animals to heat-related illness in July. Not to the heat directly. The pasture management and the water supply were both adequate, but to a bacterial infection that moved through the herd in the specific way that summer infections moved, fast and then faster, and that she caught on the 3rd animal and contained with the management she'd refined since the previous fall. 2 was too many. The math of 2 was survivable. The feeling of 2 was something else, the same feeling she'd had in October losing the first animals. The sense of failure that didn't care about the math. Dex came to her on the morning she found the 2nd animal and said, "I saw something yesterday afternoon. On the south side of the holding area. I should have told you." She looked at him. "What did you see?" He described it. A behavioral change in two of the animals, something in the way they were moving that had struck him as wrong, and that he'd filed away to mention, and then hadn't mentioned because he wasn't sure he was reading it correctly and didn't want to raise a concern that turned out to be nothing. "Tell me," she said, "whatever you see, correct or not. Even if it's probably nothing. Especially if it's probably nothing," she said. "I need to know the probablys. I can sort them out. What I can't do is sort out the things I never heard about." He nodded. He looked like he was going to say something else, and then didn't. She let it go. But she thought about it later, standing at the fence watching the remaining herd move through the summer afternoon. She had built this operation on the premise that she saw things other people didn't see. That she could look at 47 retired breeding sows in an autumn stockyard and understand their value when everyone around her was calculating their worthlessness. That vision, the ability to see potential where others saw liability, had been the foundation of everything. What she was learning now, slowly and with some resistance, was that she could not be the only one who saw. Not anymore. The operation was too large. The number of things happening simultaneously at any given moment exceeded what one person could observe, and one person's gap in observation had just cost her 2 animals. It would cost her more if she didn't change the way she thought about information. She told Clara this that evening. Clara listened. Then she said, "What do you need?" "I need people to tell me what they see, and I need to actually hear it." "Dex will tell you," Clara said, "if he knows you want it." "I told him today." "Then he'll tell you." She paused. "What about me? Am I telling you what I see?" Magnolia thought about it. "Mostly," she said, "when I let you." Clara raised an eyebrow. "I know," Magnolia said. "I'm working on it." She was. It was not comfortable work. The particular stubbornness she'd developed over 7 years of managing everything alone had served her in ways she didn't want to dismantle, but it had edges that cut the wrong direction sometimes, and she was learning, imperfectly, with backsliding, to identify which was which. The second quarterly crane delivery went out in early September. The fall was coming in earlier than the previous year, which meant the smoking conditions were better sooner, and she took advantage of it to begin the first round of fall processing while the temperature was still dropping predictably every night. The rhythm of the operation had a different quality now than it had in the first winter. Then, everything had been improvised within a framework. Now the framework was established and the improvisation happened at the edges, which was a more efficient arrangement and also a slightly less interesting one, if she was being honest with herself, which she tried to be. She missed certain things about the early weeks. She missed the particular clarity of having exactly one problem at a time, which was that she had to make this work or lose everything, full stop. Multiple problems with different priorities and interdependencies were harder to hold than one enormous single problem, in the specific way that managing complex things was harder than surviving simple catastrophe. She would not trade back. But she noticed the difference. October came. The 1-year mark arrived not as an event, but as a fact she noticed while doing the feeding one morning. The same cold, the same gray-white sky, the sound of the animals moving in the frost, and realized she was standing in almost exactly the position she'd stood in a year ago, looking at a different herd, with entirely different arithmetic. She stood there for a little longer than the feeding required. 1 year ago she'd had $41 and a plan that might not work, and the sound of laughter carrying across the Calhoun County stockyard. Now she had 3 smokehouses and a signed contract with a provisioner in Omaha and a partnership agreement with a woman she trusted completely, and a young man named Dex, who told her what he saw, and 71 animals in the pasture whose value most of the county had figured out they'd been wrong about. She was not finished. She would not have said she was finished because the operation still had failure modes she could identify, and some she probably couldn't, and the crane contract ran only through the following spring without renewal, and the legal arrangement with the Hendricks Partnership's creeping county acquisitions was still a fact of the landscape, even if it had stopped being her immediate problem. She had not solved the world. She had solved a particular set of problems that mattered to her, and built something from the solving. That was what she had. That was what it was. She went to the October auction. It was not her first choice of a way to spend the Saturday. She had 3 processing cycles in motion, and Clara was handling 2 of them, and Dex was managing the pasture, which meant she could go, And she went because she needed animals for the winter cycle, and because she had decided sometime in the spring that she was not going to avoid Calhoun County stockyards on her account. They were where she did business. She was not going to spend energy managing around them. The yard was familiar in the way of a place you'd been through something significant. Not comfortable exactly, but known. She knew the fence posts and the particular way the auctioneer's voice carried and the smell of the yard in October, which was exactly the same as it had been 12 months ago. People greeted her differently, not warmly, in most cases. This was not that kind of county, and she was not that kind of person, and warm had never been the thing she was after. But differently. There was a farmer she didn't know well who caught her eye and nodded in the way you nodded at someone you respected from a distance. There was a woman near the gate who said, without preamble, "Is it true you're paying more for retired breeders than the open market?" And when Magnolia confirmed it, said, "My neighbor's got 14. She doesn't know you by privately." And Magnolia gave her the property address and said to have her neighbor write. Submit on 20 animals through the morning. She got 16 at prices that were higher than October of the previous year and still lower than what she knew they were worth in her smokehouse, which meant the margin was smaller than it had been, but was still real. Dale Gruber was there again. He came to her this time, directly, no hesitation, which was different from September's approach at the fence. He stood beside her and watched a lot go through and said, without a preamble, "I've got a question I want to ask you straight." "Go ahead," she said. "The Hendricks partnership approached me," he said. "They want my North operation. I've been thinking about it." He paused. "You've had run-ins with them." "I've been aware of them," she said carefully. "What's your read?" She looked at him, Dale Gruber asking her read on something, asking her specifically because she had dealt with them and he hadn't, and he was smart enough to know that the information asymmetry ran in her direction on this particular question. 6 months ago, she would not have predicted this conversation. "They're not wrong that consolidation is efficient," she said, "depending on what you're measuring. If you're measuring the North operation's value to your family over time against what they'll offer, the math probably isn't what it looks like in the short run. They're offering well." "They always offer well," she said. "The question is whether in 5 years you want to be managing a contract with Hendricks or owning your own land." I was quiet for a moment. "You could have said that differently, made it simpler." "It is simple," she said. "I just said it the honest way." He looked at her for another moment. Then, "Thank you," he said, which was possibly the least expected thing Dale Gruber had ever said to her, and she received it without irony because it was given without irony. He walked away and she watched the next lot go through and thought about what it meant that Dale Gruber was asking her for counsel. Not because she had beaten him, which she hadn't. His land was his and her land was hers, and that was not a competition with a winner. But because something had shifted in how the county saw her, and that shift had a texture she was still learning to read. It was not admiration, not exactly, though there was some of that. It was more like the specific quality of attention that people paid to someone who had demonstrated that they saw things accurately. Gruber wasn't asking her because he liked her. He was asking her because she'd been right about the pigs, and he knew it. She could work with that. The partnership agreement's first-year accounting happened in November, around the kitchen table, which was where all the real accounting happened. Magnolia laid out the numbers, and Clara reviewed them, and they disagreed about one line item, a feed cost that Magnolia had been allocating to operations, and Clara thought should be split between operations and capital. And the disagreement lasted 40 minutes and was resolved by Clara being correct, which Magnolia acknowledged after she'd had 10 minutes to think about it clearly. "You do that," Clara said. "Do what?" "Think for 10 minutes after I say something before you decide if I'm right." "Is that a problem?" "No," Clara said. "I'd rather you think for 10 minutes than agree immediately. I just notice it." "I'm aware that I do it," Magnolia said. "It's a habit." "Where'd you get it?" "My father," she said. "He said never agree with something until you'd had time to find the thing wrong with it. If you couldn't find it, the thing was probably right." Clara was quiet for a moment, looking at the ledger. "The thing is right," she said, about the line item. "I know," Magnolia said. "I told you that." "After 10 minutes." "After 10 minutes," Magnolia agreed. They split the line item and closed the first year's accounting with a number that was real and solid and that Clara wrote in the ledger in the careful, precise handwriting she used for things that mattered. Magnolia watched her write it and thought about October of the previous year, about the coffee tin and the $41, and the arithmetic she'd done at this same table by lamplight trying to find a path that might exist. The path had existed. That had always been the thing. It had existed before she walked into the stockyard, before she spent the last dollar, before Gruber grabbed her arm and the crowd laughed. The path had been there. She had needed to be the kind of person who could see it and the kind of person who could walk it, and those were two different requirements that she had spent most of her life becoming, without knowing that was what she was doing. Her father had known. She thought he had known. Not the specifics. He couldn't have predicted the Smokehouse or the crane contract or Clara Henley or any of it, but the direction of her, the way she thought about animals and about value and about patience. He had taught her those things because he recognized them in her and because he understood they were worth having, and he had not lived long enough to see what she built with them. And that was the part she couldn't think about for too long without the grief of it becoming something she had to put down and walk away from. She missed him. She missed him in the specific way of losing someone who was also a teacher. Not just the person, but the source of a particular kind of knowledge that came from them and nobody else. There were things she knew that she would know forever, and things she'd still been learning when he died. And the second category was a permanent gap she'd spent 7 years working around. She had done all right. December came in quietly, without the dramatic cold snap of the previous year, the temperature dropping gradually, like someone who had decided to tell the truth slowly instead of all at once. She found she was grateful for the gentleness of it. She had enough to manage without a surprise hard freeze. The third quarterly crane delivery went out without incident. The winter processing cycles were running well. Dex had settled into the operation with the ease of someone who had found work that matched the way he thought, and he'd taken to noticing things about the animals and mentioning them without being asked, which was what she'd told him she needed, and which she made a point of responding to directly every time, because the habit was worth reinforcing, and she knew enough about her own tendencies to know she had to make the effort consciously. Ruth's knee was better through the fall, worse again in December. She came to the property less frequently, and when she came, she moved with the careful deliberateness of someone managing pain without discussing it. Magnolia didn't push her. She made sure Ruth knew the operation's numbers and direction without having to come out in the cold for them. "You don't have to keep me informed," Ruth said once. They were at the Henley kitchen table, which was where they met when Ruth's knee was bad. "I'm not a partner." "You're something," Magnolia said. Ruth looked at her. "The straw bales," Magnolia said. "In November, the year before. I sent Clara with straw bales." "You didn't have to." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Clement Boone lent my husband a piece of equipment once that saved our harvest," she said. "He never asked for anything for it, never mentioned it again." She picked up her tea. "Some things don't get balanced. They just get remembered." Magnolia held that. It was the kind of thing that was true in a way that made arguing with it feel wrong. On the last evening of the year, Magnolia went up the hill, not for any particular purpose. She had checked the smokehouses already, checked the animals, reviewed the coming week's schedule in her head, and set it aside. The operation was as settled as an operation ever was, which was to say it was manageable, which was its own kind of peace. She just wanted to be on the hill, in the cold, at the end of the year that had started with $41 and a borrowed wagon and the sound of laughter she hadn't forgotten and wasn't sure she was supposed to forget. The hill was cold in the way that Nebraska hills were cold in December. Not viciously, not the killing cold of January, but the specific settled cold of a year running down to its end. She could see both smokehouses from up here, and the second smokehouse on the Henley property through the trees to the south. The smoke rising from all three in thin columns that bent in the same direction and climbed until they disappeared into the dark sky. 3 smokehouses. Smoke rising from all of them at the same time. She had not let herself picture this specifically, back in October. She had let herself believe it was possible, which was different. The specific picture had felt dangerous to hold because specific pictures of good things had a way of becoming the measure by which the eventual reality came up short. She had learned to want things without picturing them too clearly. But standing here now, looking at it, she let herself see it. Really see it. The smoke and the cold and the dark sky and the land that was hers in a way it had been technically hers for 7 years, but was only now fully hers in the sense of having been understood and used and built into something. She thought about the things people said about women like her. She had heard most of the versions that were openly cruel and the versions that dressed cruelty up as concern, the ones that started with "bless her heart" and the ones that started with, "It's just that," and the ones that didn't start with anything, just looked at her body and made a calculation and stopped listening. She had carried all of them the way you carried things you couldn't put down. Not because they were worth carrying, but because putting them down required an act of will she had to choose. And choosing it took something she didn't always have spare. She had something spare now. She thought about what it would mean to say that what they'd said was wrong. Not wrong because she'd proved something to them. She hadn't set out to prove anything to anyone. That had never been the point. Spite was still a thin thing to build on, and she hadn't built on it. Wrong because the premise had been wrong. The idea that you could look at a person and calculate their limits from the outside, from the size of their body, the debts on their land, the absence of a husband or a father, the number of people standing behind them. That calculation was wrong in the same way the calculation about the retired breeding sows was wrong. It missed the thing that actually mattered. It looked at the visible evidence and drew conclusions without asking the question that changed everything, which was, what does this become under the right conditions? She had been the right conditions. For herself. That was all. Not heroic, not miraculous. She had known what she knew and worked what she could work, and refused a few times to do things she understood would compromise what she was building, and all of it together had become this: 3 smokehouses and smoke rising into the December dark, and a name in a ledger that was growing into something people recognized. The cold settled around her shoulders. She had been up here longer than she'd intended. Below, the farmhouse window threw a small rectangle of yellow light onto the snow, the stove still warm, the lamp she'd left on still burning. She turned and looked north toward the direction of the Calhoun County stockyard. She couldn't see it from here. It was 12 miles and dark between them, but she knew exactly where it was. She knew the fence posts and the smell and the specific position in the yard where she had stood with $41 in her coat and her heart doing something complicated while the auctioneer called the number. She did not feel triumph standing up here. She had been watching for that feeling all year, expecting it to arrive in some recognizable form, and it hadn't come. What had come instead was something quieter and more permanent, the specific satisfaction of having understood something correctly and been willing to bet on that understanding when nobody else would, and of having the outcome confirm, not that she was exceptional, but that she had been right. Those were different things. Being exceptional was about comparison. Being right was about accuracy. She had always cared more about accuracy. She had been right about the animals. She had been right about the smokehouse and the time and the patience. She had been right about Clara and Ruth, and about the kind of business she wanted to build. The kind that didn't cut corners even when cutting corners was the easier number. The kind that offered what it could meet rather than what sounded best in the room. The kind where the quality of the thing was not a marketing position, but an actual commitment that cost something to maintain. She had not been right about everything. She'd been wrong about the chimney repair timeline in January, wrong about the feed conversion rate on 3 of the spring animals, wrong to let 6 weeks pass before formalizing the partnership with Clara, wrong to miss page 4 of the crane contract the first time through. She had made mistakes that she could name and probably mistakes she hadn't recognized yet. And the operation going forward would have more of both categories because that was what operations were. Accumulations of decisions, some correct, some not, moving in a direction you chose and adjusted as you went. She was not her father's smokehouse. She was not the October auction or the $41 or the laughter that had followed her to her wagon. She was not the sum of the things that had been said about her or the things that had been done to her or the land that had nearly been taken. She was someone who had looked at a situation that most people saw as a wall and had found the door in it and had walked through and had built something on the other side. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, she thought, everything. Not in the sense that she had no more to do, because she did, the 4th quarterly delivery and the spring auction planning, and the question of whether a 4th smokehouse made sense, and the renewal conversation with Crane that would happen in February. All of that was ahead. But everything in the sense that she had become fully what she was capable of being, not a finished version, there was no finished version, but a real one. A person operating at the level of her actual self. She started down the hill. The snow was thin under her boots, just enough to record the tracks she left behind her, and she could see the prints she'd made going up, her path, specific and visible, not confused with anyone else's. She walked back through them toward the farmhouse and the warm light in the window and the work that would start again at 4:30 in the morning. She did not look back at the hill. She had already seen it. She knew what was there. The door was warm to the touch when she pushed it open, the heat of the stove meeting her in the face like something solid. She pulled off her coat and hung it on the nail by the door, the same nail that had held her coat since she was 9 years old. She poured the last of the coffee from the pot, cold and too strong, and drank it standing at the stove because that was still the habit, still the thing she did when she had more ahead of her than she had time to sit still for. Outside, in the dark. Nebraska December, the smoke from 3 smokehouses rose and bent and disappeared. It smelled like hickory and apple wood and the slow work of years. It smelled like something that had taken a long time and been done right.